Welcome to Nytheric Horror. Enjoy 3 hours of true scary stories. Ads may play in the first 15 minutes, and after 2:30, no mid-roll ads in between. Turn off the lights and let the nightmare begin. I lived in that house for almost 5 years before I finally understood what I'd actually been sharing it with. And for most of that time, I genuinely believed. The way you believe something you've talked yourself into because the alternative is exhausting. That I simply had an odd, harmless presence for a housemate. Not a malicious one. More like the kind of roommate who leaves dishes in the sink and never quite explains herself. Except this roommate opened windows in the rain and left the milk out of the fridge. I moved in about 6 months after my mother died. A fact I didn't think mattered much to the house at the time, though I understand now it mattered a great deal. She'd had a heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon, and I was 15 minutes away, stuck behind a train at a crossing that felt, in the moment, like the single cruelest coincidence life had ever handed me. And by the time I got to the hospital, she was already gone. 15 minutes. I have never been able to stop doing the math on that number, turning it over and over, imagining a version of that Tuesday where the train came a few minutes later, where I made every light green instead of red, where I got there in time to hold her hand instead of walking into a room where a nurse was already pulling a sheet up. Grief like that doesn't heal so much as it reorganizes itself around a wound that never quite closes. And I carried that particular wound, the arithmetic of 15 lost minutes, into a rented Victorian on the edge of a small Massachusetts town, without any idea that the house itself might already be carrying something disturbingly similar. I remember, in fact, choosing that house, partly because it had no clocks of its own visible anywhere when the realtor showed me through it. An empty, quiet kind of blankness that felt at the time like exactly the relief I needed from a life that had suddenly become very aware of minutes and hours in a way it never had before. The house had been built in 1911, a tall, narrow place with a steep gabled roof and a wraparound porch that had seen better decades, owned by an elderly landlord who lived 2 towns over and seemed content to let me handle most small repairs myself in exchange for a break on the rent. It had 3 bedrooms upstairs, a single bathroom, a kitchen at the back that still had its original built-in cabinets, and an attic reached through a hatch in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway that I almost never used, mostly because the pull-down ladder stuck badly, and I had no real reason to go up there in the first place. The staircase connected that upstairs hallway to a small front entryway below, and the kitchen sat at the very back of the house, reachable either through the dining room or down a narrow side hall past the bathroom, so that anything moving through the house at night had, in practice, only a handful of routes to choose from, and I would come to know every one of those routes far better than I ever wanted to. The first strange thing, the thing that started the whole slow, uneasy comedy of my time in that house, was the windows. I'd come home some evenings, especially on rainy ones, to find one of the 2 upstairs bedroom windows, the ones in the room I used for storage, standing wide open, rain soaking into the carpet beneath the sill, though I distinctly remembered closing and locking both of them that morning. It happened often enough, 3 or 4 times that first year, that I started developing a habit of checking those windows twice before I left the house. And still, every so often, I'd come home to find one open anyway, curtains plastered wet against the glass, a puddle spreading across the floor. Then there was the food. I'd find containers in the fridge left open, lids sitting askew beside them, contents untouched as far as I could tell. Nothing missing, nothing eaten, just opened, as though someone had gotten halfway through checking what was inside and lost interest before finishing the job. I blamed myself at first, the way you do, assuming I'd simply forgotten to snap a lid shut in a hurry one morning, until it started happening with containers I knew for certain I hadn't touched in days. I want to be honest that none of this frightened me particularly, not in that first year. It annoyed me. I found myself talking to the house sometimes, half joking, telling whatever was up there that if it wanted to live with me, it could at least close the windows behind itself. I want to be clear that I did not, at that point, believe I was talking to anything real. It felt more like a habit you fall into living alone, a way of narrating your own irritation out loud in an empty house. I mentioned it once to a friend who came over for dinner that first winter, describing the whole business of the windows and the fridge as though it were a mildly funny anecdote about an old, quirky house. And she laughed along with me the way you'd expect, calling it charming in the way old houses are supposed to be charming, and I remember feeling, that night, a small flicker of unease at how easily I'd managed to make it sound harmless out loud, as though naming it out loud to someone else had cost me something I hadn't noticed losing until the words were already out of my mouth. It was the clocks that made me start taking it seriously, though even then, for a long while, I kept finding ways to laugh about it rather than sit with how strange it actually was. I'd inherited 2 antique cuckoo clocks from my grandmother, both of them older than I was. Both of them kept in good working order by a clock repair man in town who serviced them once a year and always told me, with real pride, that mechanisms built that well simply didn't stop unless something interfered with them directly. Within my first 8 months in that house, both clocks stopped, on different days, for no reason the repairman could ever identify. He'd open the case, check the weights, check the escapement, find absolutely nothing wrong, wind them back up, and within a week or two, one or the other would be silent, and still again, hands frozen at whatever hour they happened to occupy when they gave out. I bought a plain battery-operated wall clock for the kitchen after that, thinking a modern mechanism might fare better, and it went through batteries faster than any clock I'd ever owned. Brand new sets dead within days, rather than the months they were supposed to last. And I went through 4 different clocks that first 2 years, different brands, different styles, all of them eating through batteries the same unnatural way, as though something in that kitchen were draining them on purpose. I started keeping a small stash of fresh batteries in the junk drawer specifically for that clock, buying them 2 packs at a time. And I remember standing in the hardware store aisle one afternoon, running a rough tally in my head of how many batteries I'd gone through that year alone, and feeling, for the first time, a genuine chill at how absurd the number had become, far beyond anything a faulty clock mechanism should have accounted for. My watch went next, in my second year there, and this was the one that first made the hair stand up on my arms, rather than just irritating me. I'd gone to bed wearing it, a habit I'd kept since college, and woken to find it on the floor beside my bed, the crystal shattered into a spray of fine cracks. The strap still buckled shut the way I'd left it, as though it had simply been removed from my wrist without ever being unbuckled, and then dropped or thrown hard enough to break. I checked my own wrist for a mark, some sign of how it could have come off without waking me, and found nothing at all. No redness, no bruise, no explanation whatsoever for how a watch, still fastened, ends up shattered on the floor several feet from the bed. I lay awake a long time after that particular morning, running my thumb over the smooth, unbroken skin of my own wrist, trying to reconcile the buckled strap with the distance the watch had somehow traveled. And it was the first night since moving into that house that I found myself getting up to check the lock on my own bedroom door, a habit that felt faintly ridiculous even as I did it, since nothing about a lock explained a strap that hadn't been undone. I started joking about it with friends around that time, telling them I had a ghost roommate who hated punctuality, and everyone laughed, and I laughed along with them, because it was easier than sitting with how much that broken watch had actually rattled me. The thing that finally cracked my ability to laugh it off happened 2 Christmases into living there, when my aunt gave me a brand new Kit Kat clock. One of those grinning black cat clocks with the tail that swings like a pendulum and the eyes that shift side to side with each tick. The kind of kitschy, cheerful thing that had nothing ominous about it whatsoever. I hung it on the kitchen wall myself, proud of how it brightened up an otherwise plain room, and for about 3 weeks it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Tail swinging, eyes ticking back and forth, filling the kitchen with a small, silly kind of company while I cooked. I was standing at the stove on a Saturday evening, stirring a pot of something on the back burner, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, fast, low, and by the time I turned my head, the cat clock was already airborne, sailing clean off the wall and across the kitchen as though it had been flung rather than fallen, striking the cabinet on the far side hard enough that the plastic case cracked wide open, the tail snapping off and skittering under the table. I stood there with the wooden spoon still in my hand, staring at the wreckage of a clock that had been screwed firmly into the wall not 5 seconds earlier, and for the first time since I'd moved into that house, what I felt wasn't irritation. It was fear, sudden and complete, the kind that drops straight into your stomach before your mind has caught up to explain it. I remember turning off the stove with a hand that wasn't quite steady, leaving dinner half-cooked, and sitting at the kitchen table for a long time afterward, simply staring at the broken pieces on the floor, unable to make myself sweep them up right away, as though cleaning up the evidence too quickly might mean admitting there was nothing accidental left to explain. I did what I imagine most people do at that point. I told myself it must have come loose from the wall on its own, that the swinging pendulum tail had worked the screw free over those 3 weeks, that gravity alone had carried it that distance across the room, though even as I constructed that explanation I knew, somewhere underneath the part of my brain doing the talking, that no falling object simply flies sideways 6 feet before it hits the ground. I called the clock repairman again after that, not about a working clock this time, but out of some vague hope that a man who understood mechanisms might have an explanation for a mechanism-hating house. And he listened to my whole story with more patience than I expected, and told me, at the end of it, something I hadn't anticipated. He said that in almost 40 years of servicing clocks in that county, he'd worked on plenty of old houses with plenty of odd little quirks, drafts and settling, and the occasional client who swore up and down their grandfather clock kept losing time on its own, but that a client actively hostile to every clock she owned, rather than simply unlucky, was something he'd only ever encountered once before, decades earlier, in a different house entirely, and that the woman living there at the time had eventually told him a story about the house's previous owner that he'd never quite been able to shake. He told me he still thought about that other client sometimes, an elderly woman who'd finally moved out of her own house rather than replace a 5th broken clock, and that some part of him had always regretted not asking her more about what she'd actually seen before she left town for good. He didn't push the story on me, and to his credit, he made clear he wasn't in the business of telling ghost stories to spook a client into more service calls. He simply mentioned, almost offhand, that houses in that part of the state sometimes carried names attached to them in the town records, past owners whose stories lingered in deed records and old newspaper archives even after their families had moved on. And he suggested, if I wanted to satisfy my own curiosity, that the Town Historical Society kept those kinds of records on file for anyone who asked. I didn't go right away. I want to be honest that some part of me spent a good 2 weeks doing everything I could to talk myself out of it, cleaning up the broken cat clock, buying a fifth-wall clock I fully expected to fail within days, telling myself that a house with old wiring and older pipes simply produced strange results sometimes, and that chasing down a dead woman's story was the kind of thing that belonged in. The ghost stories my friends had already started telling at my expense, rather than in my own actual life. It was another cold night of that same ticking sound, moving room to room with no clock left in the house to produce it, that finally sent me down to the Historical Society on my lunch break, rather than putting it off any further. I went, mostly out of the same restless need for an explanation that had sent me digging through my own mother's old photographs in the year after she died, looking for some detail that might make her absence make more sense. What I found in that small, dusty records room was a woman named Vera Ashford, who had lived in my house from 1938 until her death in 1974, and whose husband, Walter, had shipped out with the Army in the winter of 1943 and never come home. He'd been listed as missing in action for almost 2 years before the Army finally confirmed, in a telegram Vera kept for the rest of her life, that he had died overseas. Though even then, according to a brief profile the local paper ran on her in the 1960s, she had never fully accepted it. Kept his side of the bed made up every single day, and kept, on the kitchen wall of that same house, a clock she wound every morning at exactly the hour his train had been scheduled to leave for the war. A small daily ritual of waiting that the article described with a kind of gentle small-town pity, as having gone on for over 30 years. I sat in that records room for a long time after reading it, thinking about 15 minutes and a train crossing, about a woman winding a clock every morning for 3 decades, for a man who was never coming back through that door, and I understood, with a clarity that made my hands go cold, that whatever lived in my house did not hate clocks out of some random supernatural quirk. It hated them because every single one of them, ticking away in that kitchen, in that hallway, on my own wrist, measured out exactly the kind of waiting she had spent her entire remaining life drowning in. Things changed after that, in a way I can only describe as the house no longer bothering to disguise itself as harmless. The windows stopped opening in the rain. Instead, I started waking at night to the sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the house. Though I owned no working clocks left by that point, every single one either broken or removed after the Kit Kat incident, and the ticking would grow louder and closer over the course of several minutes, until it seemed to be coming from directly outside my bedroom door. And then it would simply stop, all at once, leaving a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. I mentioned the ticking to a coworker one afternoon, mostly to have someone else's reaction to measure my own fear against, and she suggested, kindly enough, that I have my hearing checked, that tinnitus sometimes presented as a rhythmic sound in otherwise quiet rooms, and I let her believe I found that reassuring, because it was easier than explaining that the sound had a direction to it, a point of origin that moved from the stairwell to the hallway to my own door over the course of several nights, in a way no ringing in my ears had ever done. I found the attic hatch open one morning, the pull-down ladder extended, though I hadn't touched it in the 2 years I'd lived there, and it stuck badly enough that I knew from experience it took real effort to force it down. I went up against every instinct telling me not to, and found, in the far corner beneath the eaves, a small wooden calendar box. The kind with a rotating dial you turn by hand each day to mark the date, its dial frozen on a day in October. And beside it, tucked into a rotted cardboard box, a stack of old letters tied with string, a folded, faded photograph of a young man in uniform, and a stopped alarm clock, its hands fixed at exactly 7:15, which I would later confirm. Cross-referencing the old newspaper article was the exact hour Walter's train had left the station in 1943. I sat up there a long time, longer than I meant to, reading a handful of the letters despite a growing feeling that I had no business doing so. Most of them ordinary and tender in the plain way wartime letters often are. Requests for photographs, small complaints about the food, a running joke about a dog Vera had apparently kept and Walter had apparently never liked. None of them prepared me for the last one in the stack, which wasn't from Walter at all, but from the Army itself. The telegram my earlier research had already told me about, its folded creases gone soft and furred with age. And beneath it, in Vera's own handwriting on a scrap of paper I don't believe she ever meant anyone else to read. A single line asking, in a hand that grew shakier toward the end of the sentence, whether a person could be blamed for refusing to let a single minute pass without noticing it, when noticing every minute was the only proof she had left that she was still the one waiting for him, and not simply someone who had given up. I did not sleep well after finding that box, and it was 3 nights later that the house finally stopped simply breaking clocks and came for something it understood mattered to me more than any clock ever could. I kept my mother's old wristwatch, the one she'd been wearing the day she died, in a small dish on my bedroom dresser. Not worn, just kept there. Close, the way you keep certain objects not for their use, but for the fact of having them near you. I woke that third night to the sound of that ticking again, closer than it had ever been, directly in the room this time rather than beyond the door. And when I sat up and turned on the lamp, the dish on my dresser was empty, my mother's watch gone from where it always sat. I found it a moment later, in the hand of something standing at the foot of my bed, a shape built roughly along the outline of a woman, in a plain, high-collared dress that belonged to another era entirely. And the single detail that has never once faded from my memory in the years since is her shadow, cast long and strange across my bedroom floor by the lamp behind her, moving noticeably behind her actual body, lagging half a second or more with every small shift of her weight. And then, whenever she paused, snapping forward all at once to catch up with her. A small, sickening jerk like a film strip skipping a frame, as though whatever she was could not manage to move through time the same smooth, continuous way the rest of us do. I lay there for what felt like a very long time, unable to make my body do anything but breathe, watching that shadow lag and snap, and some part of me understood, even frozen with fear, that I was watching something experience time itself as a kind of injury, a wound it couldn't stop reopening, no matter how still it tried to hold itself. She held my mother's watch, pinched between 2 fingers, and as I watched, frozen, she closed her whole hand around it, slow and deliberate. And I heard, even across the room, the faint crunch of the crystal giving way inside her fist. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember lunging off the bed toward her, some instinct older than fear taking over, reaching for her closed hand, for whatever was left of my mother's watch inside it, and her other hand came up fast, faster than that lagging, stuttering shadow should have allowed, and closed around my wrist with a grip cold enough to burn, dragging me half off my feet toward her before I wrenched free, stumbling back against the dresser hard enough to knock the empty dish to the floor, where it shattered. For one terrible instant, close enough to her that I could see the fine, faded stitching along the collar of that old-fashioned dress, I saw her face clearly, ordinary in almost every way. A woman, perhaps in her 60s, lined and tired in the particular way of someone who has spent a lifetime looking toward a door, and it was that very ordinariness, more than anything sharper or crueler might have, that has stayed with me since, because it meant whatever I was fighting off that night had once simply been a person, worn down slowly by exactly the kind of waiting I understood far better than I wanted to. She was gone by the time I found my footing again, the room simply empty, the lamp still burning, and on the floor where she'd stood lay my mother's watch, crushed flat, the crystal a spray of fine fragments, the hands bent and frozen at an hour that meant nothing to me, that I have never been able to make correspond to anything in either my mother's death or Vera's own long, ticking vigil, though I have spent more hours than I'd like to admit trying. I sat on the floor of that bedroom until the sky outside began to lighten, holding the ruined watch in both hands, and I remember thinking, with a strange, exhausted clarity, that grief seemed to move through that house the way water moves through old pipes, finding whichever crack in a person it could reach, regardless of whose grief it had originally belonged to. My wrist bore a mark for almost 2 weeks afterward, a pale, cold-looking bruise in the shape of a full hand, each finger distinct, and it never fully warmed to the touch the way an ordinary bruise does, staying faintly cool even under a hot shower until the day it finally faded entirely. I moved out within the month, breaking my lease early and eating the cost without much argument, and my landlord, when I finally told him the whole story rather than some vague excuse about a new job, went quiet on the phone for a long moment before telling me, almost reluctantly, that the tenant before me had also left early, and the one before that, though none of them, as far as he knew, had ever mentioned clocks specifically. He asked me, before we hung up, whether I thought he should have the house blessed or looked at by someone, and I told him honestly that I didn't know, that nothing about my time there had suggested Vera wanted to be reasoned with or appeased so much as simply left alone with whatever she was still keeping count of, and that I doubted any stranger walking through those rooms once would understand her the way 5 slow years of broken clocks had eventually taught me to. I still have my mother's crushed watch. I never got the crystal replaced. It sits in a drawer now rather than a dish on a dresser, and some nights, in whatever apartment I'm renting that year, I find myself listening for a ticking that isn't there, checking my own wrist out of old habit even though I stopped wearing a watch entirely after that house. I've caught myself, more than once, noticing exactly how many minutes have passed since I last checked the time, counting them the way you'd count something you were afraid of losing track of. And it occurs to me sometimes, uncomfortably, that I may have carried a small piece of Vera's own habit out of that house along with everything else. 2 months ago, visiting a friend who now rents that same Victorian without knowing any of its history, I noticed, hanging in her kitchen in the exact spot where my Kit Kat clock once hung, a plain, ordinary wall clock, ticking away cheerfully above the stove, its battery. She mentioned without any particular concern, somehow already needing to be replaced for the second time that month. I didn't tell her why that detail made my stomach drop the way it did. I only asked, as casually as I could manage, whether she'd found the attic hatch easy to open, and she looked at me strangely and said she'd never once needed to use it. My grandparents bought their house in 1968. And by the time I was old enough to remember it, everyone in the family treated the place almost like another relative. It stood in a small town in upstate New York, on a street lined with maples and homes much newer than theirs. The place had been built sometime in the 1860s, long before cars, electrical wiring, central heating, or indoor plumbing had been part of the original design. Over the years, different owners had added things wherever they could fit them, so the layout was slightly odd but familiar to all of us. The front entrance opened into a narrow hall with a staircase immediately on the right. A formal parlor sat to the left, although my grandparents used it as an ordinary living room. Behind that was a dining room with 2 tall windows facing the side yard. The kitchen occupied the rear of the first floor. Beyond it was a small mudroom, a pantry, and a second set of steep stairs that came up beside the linen closet on the second floor. There was also a cellar beneath the kitchen, accessed through a heavy wooden door near the pantry. Upstairs, my grandparents slept in the large front bedroom. A smaller room beside it had belonged to my mother when she was growing up. Another bedroom faced the backyard and was used for guests. At the end of the hall was a narrow sewing room containing an old treadle machine, shelves of towels, and several pieces of furniture nobody seemed willing to throw away. The attic was reached through a normal door beside the sewing room. Its staircase was steep enough that children were told not to use it without an adult. Every part of that house smelled different. The parlor had fireplace ash and furniture polish. The kitchen carried coffee, onions, and whatever my grandmother happened to be cooking. The upstairs hall smelled faintly of old plaster and linen. The attic was dry wood, dust, and cardboard. I loved the place. Most of my childhood holidays happened there. Thanksgiving meant too many people squeezed around the dining table. Christmas meant coats piled on my mother's old bed. Summer afternoons usually ended on the back porch with my grandfather complaining that somebody had left the screen door open. There were also stories. Nothing dramatic. Nobody in the family said the house was haunted. Instead, people told little anecdotes and laughed afterward. My mother claimed that when she was a teenager, she once left a sweater and jeans on her bedroom floor before going to sleep. In the morning, both had been folded neatly at the foot of her bed. She accused her mother. Grandma denied doing it. Mom accused Grandpa. He asked why he would sneak into his teenage daughter's bedroom at midnight to fold jeans. That ended the argument. My aunt had a similar story. She spent a weekend there during college and dropped a wet bath towel beside the guest bed because she was too tired to hang it properly. When she woke, the towel had been folded into a narrow rectangle and placed across the back of a chair. It was still damp. Nobody admitted touching it. Another time, my cousin Daniel was alone downstairs when the vacuum cleaner started in the dining room. The machine was old, upright, and loud enough to hear from almost anywhere in the house. Daniel assumed Grandma had come downstairs. He went to help her. Nobody was there. The vacuum stood in the middle of the rug. Running, he switched it off. My grandparents were both upstairs. The cord had been plugged into the wall. Daniel insisted he had seen Grandma wrap that cord around the handle and put the machine in the pantry earlier. Grandpa said somebody must have moved it. Daniel asked who. Grandpa had no answer. That was how most stories ended. No answer. Then everybody moved on. My grandmother, Margaret, had the least interest in discussing any of it. Whenever someone joked about a helpful ghost, she rolled her eyes. "This house is old," she would say. "Old houses do things." I once asked what kind of house folded towels. She replied, "One with better manners than you." That ended the conversation. When I was 17, my mother died. Her death had nothing to do with the house. She was killed by a drunk driver less than 10 miles from where we lived. One afternoon, she was alive, irritated that I had forgotten to take chicken out of the freezer. That evening, a state trooper was sitting at our kitchen table. I moved through the months after her funeral like someone had lowered the volume on everything. My father tried. He really did. But he had lost his wife, and I had lost my mother. And neither of us knew how to help the other. My grandparents became the place I went when home felt unbearable. Grandma never pushed me to talk. She fed me. She made tea. She let me sleep in my mother's childhood bedroom without commenting on the fact that I sometimes stayed there all weekend. Grandpa would ask if I wanted to help him in the yard or go into town for breakfast. If I said no, he left me alone. The house became tied to my mother in a way that went beyond memories. Her handwriting was still inside the pantry where she had once marked her height against the doorframe. An old-school photograph remained in the upstairs hall. Her initials were scratched into the underside of a windowsill in the guest room. I could sit at Grandma's kitchen table and remember Mom sitting in the same chair 10 years earlier. That mattered to me, probably more than it should have. By the time I was 31, Grandma was 83 and Grandpa was 86. They had slowed down, but they were still living independently. Then, Grandma suffered a severe stroke. She survived, but she never returned home. For 4 months, she went between hospital care and rehabilitation. Grandpa visited nearly every day. I visited as often as work allowed. She died in February. Grandpa sat beside her bed holding her hand. I stood near the window. Afterward, he said almost nothing. That frightened me more than if he had fallen apart. Margaret had been his wife for 61 years. He returned to the house alone. That was when the old stories stopped being funny. At first, I stayed with him because everyone thought he shouldn't be alone. My aunt lived farther away. My cousins had children and jobs. I was single and worked remotely 3 days a week, so the practical solution was obvious. I moved into the back guest bedroom. I told myself it would be temporary. A few weeks, maybe a month. That first night, Grandpa went to bed around 9. I stayed downstairs answering emails. At 10:30, I noticed a dish towel on the kitchen floor. I had dropped it earlier after wiping water near the sink. I picked it up, hung it over the oven handle, then returned to my laptop. Around midnight, I went upstairs. The towel was lying at the foot of my bed. Folded, I stood in the doorway looking at it. The fabric had been arranged with unusual precision, not simply folded in half. The edges were tucked inward, so the entire towel formed a compact rectangle about the size of a paperback book. I checked Grandpa's room. He was asleep. I carried the towel downstairs and hung it back in the kitchen. The next morning, I asked if he had moved it. He looked confused. "What towel?" I told him. He shrugged. "Your grandmother used to fold them that way." That caught my attention. "Like that exactly?" Everything had a way. He poured cereal into a bowl. "Your grandmother had systems." I laughed a little. Grandpa didn't. He looked toward the kitchen doorway. Then he said, "Somebody else did too." I asked what he meant. He changed the subject. Over the next several weeks, small things happened regularly. I left a cardigan over the back of a dining chair. The next morning, it was folded on the seat. Grandpa dropped a washcloth beside the bathroom sink. I found it hanging perfectly straight from the towel bar. A basket of clean laundry I had planned to sort after dinner was stacked by category when I came back from taking a phone call. Shirts, socks, underwear, towels, nobody else had been inside. At first, I found it almost comforting. I understood why the family had called the presents helpful. There was nothing threatening about finding a clean kitchen or neatly arranged clothing. More than once, I joked aloud. Thanks, nothing answered. Then, the vacuum cleaner started. Grandma had replaced the old upright years earlier with a newer canister model. It lived in the pantry beneath the stairs. One afternoon, Grandpa was napping upstairs while I worked in the dining room. I heard the motor begin in the parlor. I knew immediately what it was. The sound carried through the entire first floor. I walked through the doorway. The vacuum stood on the rug near the fireplace. The hose lay stretched across the floor. The power switch was on. No one held it. The machine did not move, it simply ran. I unplugged the cord from the wall. The motor stopped. Then I noticed the rug. A clean stripe crossed the center. The pile had been brushed in one direction. A second stripe ran beside it. Somebody had actually used the machine. I went upstairs. Grandpa was sleeping on his side. I woke him gently. He blinked at me. "What's wrong? Did you come downstairs?" "No. Did you get the vacuum out?" He stared at me. Then his expression changed slightly. "Where was it?" "In the parlor." He sat up. For several seconds, he seemed to consider whether to tell me something. Finally, he said, "Leave it there." "Why?" "Just leave it." I didn't. I put it back in the pantry. That evening, Grandpa told me about the first time he and Grandma experienced something unusual. It happened in 1970. They had owned the house less than 2 years. My mother was still a child. Grandma had left a basket of ironing in the sewing room before going into town. When she returned, every shirt had been pressed. Not badly. Perfectly. Collars crisp. Sleeves smooth. Grandpa thought she had finished earlier and forgotten. Grandma insisted she hadn't. A few months later, the same thing happened with bed sheets. Then towels, then the vacuum. "Did you ever see anybody?" I asked. Grandpa shook his head. "Your grandmother thought she did once." "What did she see?" He hesitated. "Somebody in the sewing room." "Who?" She wouldn't say. That annoyed me. Grandpa, he looked tired. It was 50 years ago. If she saw something, what did it look like? He rubbed one hand across his jaw. "She said a woman." I waited. "That's it?" She didn't want to talk about it. "Why not?" He looked toward the staircase. "Because after she saw her, the helping stopped for almost a year." That was the first detail that made me uneasy. Not because a woman was frightening, because Grandma had apparently understood the same distinction I was beginning to feel. Things can be comforting while they remain invisible. Once you imagine a person doing them, the entire experience changes. I stopped thanking the house. The activity did not stop. If anything, it became more personal. Grandpa had medication he took every morning and evening. I organized his pills in a plastic weekly case. One Tuesday, I came downstairs and found the case open on the kitchen table. 7 morning doses had been arranged in a straight line beside his coffee cup. I hadn't done it. He hadn't either. That worried me. A folded towel was harmless. Moving medication was not. I told Grandpa we needed to keep the pill case in my room. He became irritated. "You're making too much of this. Somebody took your medicine out. And put it where I could see it." "That's not the point." "What is the point?" "The point is I don't know who's touching your stuff." He laughed once. "You think there's a burglar who folds laundry?" I did not answer. That evening, I put the medicine in the drawer beside my bed. The drawer had a small brass key. I locked it. The next morning, the pill organizer was on Grandpa's bedside table. The drawer remained locked. The key was still in my wallet. I started thinking more seriously about the house's history. Not because I wanted a ghost story. I wanted context. The town library had digitized old property records and newspaper notices, but the information was incomplete. I spent one rainy afternoon going through census entries, scanned obituaries, and deed summaries. The house had been built for a man named Edwin Vale, a local attorney. His wife died relatively young. They had 3 children. 2 married and moved away. The oldest daughter, Rebecca, stayed. She never married. Records showed her living in the house with her widowed father for decades. Edwin died there in 1911. Rebecca remained. She was involved in church charity work, sewing circles, and something the newspaper called household relief, which seemed to involve helping sick or elderly neighbors. She died in 1938. That was all I found. No murder, no tragedy, no article saying she haunted the place. I did not tell Grandpa because I knew exactly what he would say. A woman who spent her life taking care of her father. A house where things cleaned themselves. It was tempting to make the pieces fit. I resisted. The next incident made that harder. Grandpa had a doctor's appointment on a Friday morning. I woke at 7 and went into the kitchen. His coat was gone from the hook. His shoes were not beside the mudroom bench. For one horrible second, I thought he had left alone. Then I found everything upstairs. His clothes had been laid across the bed. Dark trousers, blue shirt, sweater vest, socks. The shoes sat neatly beneath the edge. His coat was folded across the chair. Grandpa stood in the doorway behind me. "What are you doing? I didn't do this." He looked at the bed. A strange expression crossed his face. Margaret used to lay my clothes out. I felt a chill across my back. "This isn't Grandma." His face hardened. I didn't say it was. We went to the appointment. The doctor told him he needed additional testing because his heart rhythm had become irregular. He was also concerned about several dizzy spells Grandpa had not mentioned to me. On the drive home, I said we should discuss whether living alone was still realistic. He became angry immediately. "I'm not leaving my house. I didn't say tomorrow. I'm not going to some place where they tell me when to eat. There are other options." "No," I tried again. He cut me off. "Your grandmother died. That doesn't mean everything has to disappear." The words hit me harder than he probably intended, because that was exactly how I had felt after Mom. I stopped arguing. That night, someone emptied the suitcase I had started packing for him. I had placed several shirts, toiletries, and documents inside because he was scheduled for 2 days of hospital testing the following week. In the morning, the suitcase sat open on the guest bed. Empty, every item had been returned to its normal location. Toothbrush in the bathroom, shirts in the closet, papers back on the dining table. Even the socks were inside his dresser drawer. Grandpa did not have the strength or balance to carry everything upstairs during the night without waking me. When I confronted him, he swore he had not touched it. I believed him. I repacked. The following morning, the same thing happened. This time, one item was different. My grandmother's old hairbrush was lying inside the empty suitcase. I had not seen it since her death. I put the brush in a drawer downstairs and packed Grandpa's things for a third time. Then, I placed the suitcase in my bedroom. I shut the door. Nothing moved that night. The hospital tests showed that Grandpa needed a minor procedure. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough that his doctor strongly encouraged us to arrange help after discharge. My aunt and I agreed that he should stay with her for a week. When I told him, he stared at me for a long time. Then he said, "It won't like that." I almost laughed. He did not. "What won't?" He looked toward the back stairs. "Whatever's been keeping this place." That was the first time he admitted it directly. I sat across from him at the kitchen table. "You think there's someone here?" "I think there has been since before your mother was born. Why didn't you tell us?" "Tell you what? That towels fold themselves? You said Grandma saw a woman. Once, Ann?" He looked down at his hands. "She said the hands were wrong." That phrase stayed with me. What was wrong with them? She couldn't explain it. "Try." He shook his head. "Your grandmother said the fingers looked folded." I didn't understand. "Broken?" "No, he took the corner of a napkin and bent it into a right angle. Folded, that was all he would say." The first time I saw the woman was 3 nights later. Grandpa was asleep in the front bedroom. I was in the guest room reading. Around 11, I heard fabric moving in the hallway. A soft, sliding sound. I assumed Grandpa was up. I opened my door. Someone stood at the far end of the hall, near the sewing room. The figure was turned slightly away. An elderly woman. Not transparent. Not glowing. If I had seen her through a window during the day, I might have assumed she was a real person. She wore a dark ankle-length dress and a pale apron. Her hair was pinned close to her head. Nothing about her clothing seemed theatrical. Then I noticed her hands. They hung beside her hips. Each finger was bent sharply at the middle joint. not curled naturally, bent into clean angles, as if someone had taken them one by one and folded them halfway. The tips pointed inward toward the palms without touching them. Her wrists were straight. She moved one hand. The fingers opened, not smoothly. Each joint unfolded separately. Little finger, ring, middle, index, thumb, then they closed again. I could not move. The woman faced the sewing room door. She did not look at me. A stack of bath towels sat on the hall table between us. She raised one hand. The top towel lifted slightly at one corner. Then another edge turned inward. The towel folded itself into a precise rectangle. I stepped backward. The floorboard beneath me creaked. The woman stopped. Her head turned. I saw only part of her face. Ordinary cheek, deep crease beside the mouth, gray eyebrow. No empty eyes or rotting skin. That normality terrified me. She looked toward my room, then toward Grandpa's bedroom. I shut my door. I did not sleep. In the morning, the folded towel remained on the table. I took a picture before touching it. Grandpa looked at the photo and said nothing. I told him we were going to my aunt's after his hospital stay, whether he liked it or not. For the first time, he did not argue. The day before his procedure, the house became openly hostile. I spent the afternoon packing. Every time I left a room, something changed. A shirt disappeared from the suitcase and returned to the closet. His shaving kit moved back into the bathroom. The hospital paperwork ended up under the dining room placemat. I finally zipped everything inside the case and kept it beside me in the kitchen. Around 6, I heard the sewing machine upstairs. Grandma's old treadle machine had not been used in years. The foot pedal began moving, slowly, then faster. The mechanical clatter traveled through the ceiling. Grandpa looked up from his chair. "Don't go. I need to know what's happening." You know, I stayed downstairs. The machine ran for nearly 5 minutes, then stopped. We slept with our bedroom doors open. At 2:13 in the morning, Grandpa called my name. His voice sounded wrong. I went into his room. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with one hand pressed to his chest. "I'm dizzy." I turned on the lamp. His skin looked gray. I called 911. The dispatcher told me to keep him seated and unlock the front entrance for paramedics. I went downstairs. The deadbolt would not move. I tried again. The lock turned halfway, then slid back by itself. I used both hands. Same thing. The metal rotated and returned. I ran to the kitchen. The back door had a simple thumb latch. It moved normally. The door itself would not open. It felt as if someone had braced against it from outside. I called out to the dispatcher that I was having trouble with the exits. She told me responders were already on the way. From upstairs, Grandpa shouted. I ran back. He was lying down now. A blanket covered him. I had left it folded at the foot of the bed. The edges had been tucked tightly underneath the mattress, so tightly that he could not pull his legs free. I tore the blanket loose. The room smelled of starch. Then the bedroom door began closing. I caught it before it shut. Something pulled from the hallway side. I had both hands on the knob. The force increased. My feet slid across the floorboards. I shouted. The door jerked hard enough to wrench my shoulder. Then the pulling stopped. I opened it. The woman stood in the hall. She was 6 feet away, her head tilted toward Grandpa's room. The fingers on both hands were folded into those sharp angles. I said, "Move." My voice shook. She remained where she was. Behind me, Grandpa whispered, "Rebecca." I looked back. "Who?" He was staring past me. The woman took one step forward. There was no sound from her shoes. I backed into the bedroom. She entered the doorway. Then she reached for the blanket. Not Grandpa, the bedding. Her hand moved over the fabric. The loose edge began pulling itself beneath the mattress again. I grabbed it. No, her face turned toward me. For the first time, I saw it fully. She looked old, but not dead. Fine lines around the eyes, thin lips, a small mole near the chin. What disturbed me was the expression. Not rage, concern, the same look a nurse might give a difficult patient. She reached for my wrist. I pulled away. Her fingers unfolded, one joint at a time. Then she grabbed me. The strength in that hand was impossible. I tried to twist free. The sharply bent fingers pressed into my skin. Pain shot up my forearm. She pulled me toward the side of the bed. The other hand reached for Grandpa's shoulder. I hit her arm. It felt solid, warm through the sleeve. The woman did not react. She tried to push him flat. Grandpa cried out. I shoved harder. Leave him alone. Her grip tightened. My skin felt as if it were being pinched between metal clamps. I struck her face with my free hand. Again, solid contact. Her head moved slightly. The concerned expression disappeared. Both hands opened. Every finger straightened at a different speed. Then she seized my upper arm and threw me against the dresser. The mirror cracked when my shoulder hit the frame. I fell. The woman bent over Grandpa. She began smoothing the blanket across his chest. He was struggling to breathe. I grabbed the wooden bedside chair and swung it. One leg struck her back. The chair broke. She staggered. I pulled Grandpa upright. From downstairs came the sound of the front door opening. The paramedics had arrived. I shouted. The woman turned toward the hallway. For 1 second, every towel inside the linen closet lifted from the shelves. I saw them through the open door. White fabric rose, folded inward, and dropped into perfect stacks. Then, the upstairs hall went silent. The woman was gone. 2 paramedics appeared at the top of the stairs. They found me sitting on the floor beside the bed, bleeding from one elbow. Grandpa was taken to the hospital. His heart rhythm had become dangerously irregular, but doctors stabilized him. He stayed 4 nights. My aunt came to the house the next morning with me. I did not want to go alone. The physical damage remained. The dresser mirror had a long diagonal crack. The broken chair was on the floor. The blanket had been tucked completely beneath 3 sides of the mattress. My wrist carried 5 deep bruises, not round fingerprints. Each mark had an angular bend in the middle, following the shape of the fingers that had gripped me. My aunt photographed them. The front deadbolt also had fresh scratches around the inner plate. A locksmith later inspected it. He said the mechanism had been forced hard enough to bend an internal piece. The back door had a different problem. The lower edge had shifted against the frame. The wood near the hinge was compressed, as if tremendous pressure had pushed from the kitchen side. There was no explanation for that either. Then we opened the sewing room. A square of pale fabric lay on the table. It had been cut from one of Grandpa's hospital shirts. The shirt had been packed inside the suitcase downstairs. We found the suitcase still zipped. One sleeve now had a rectangular section missing. The cut was perfectly straight. My aunt sat down. I think he needs to move. I agreed. Grandpa did not return to the house. After discharge, he stayed with my aunt. Later, he moved into a small assisted living apartment 10 minutes from her home. He hated leaving. I hated making him. That house held almost everything I had left of my mother, my grandmother, and the childhood version of our family. For weeks, I felt as if selling it meant losing them again. Then I remembered the woman standing over Grandpa. Care can become something else when it refuses to let a person leave. I finally understood that preserving a place is not the same as preserving the people who lived there. We cleared the house over the summer. Most of the strange activities stopped once Grandpa was gone. There were still small things. A dropped rag folded overnight. A broom left upright in the middle of the kitchen. A stack of newspapers arranged by date. nothing aggressive, almost as if the house had returned to its old habits. While emptying the attic, I found a wooden trunk that had belonged to a previous owner. Inside were old tax records, letters, photographs, and several household notebooks. One contained the name Rebecca Vale. Most pages were ordinary. Grocery expenses, church donations, lists of sewing work. Near the back, there were several entries from the final year of her father's life. He will not stay in bed. He insists on going outside. Doctor says keep him quiet. Later, Father tried the front hall again. Must keep doors secured at night. Then, one line that made me close the book. If he leaves, there will be no one left to care for. I did not take that as an explanation. It could have meant anything. A tired daughter caring for an elderly parent can write things she does not mean literally. I put the notebook back in the trunk. The house sold that autumn. A young couple bought it. They had 2 children. I never told them anything. I still feel guilty about that. At the same time, what would I have said? Sometimes your laundry may be folded. Sometimes a machine may start when nobody is in the room. If you become old or sick, do not let the house decide what care means. There was no responsible way to say any of that. Grandpa lived another 3 years. He adapted better than I expected. His apartment was bright, small, and easy to manage. He complained about the food, but liked the staff. We visited often. He died peacefully in his sleep at 90. I was with my aunt when we cleared his apartment. There had been no unusual activity there. No folded clothes appearing in strange places. No machines running by themselves. No sign that anything had followed him. That helped me. I began to think whatever lived in the old house belonged to the building. Maybe it had always belonged there. Maybe we had simply spent 50 years sharing space with something that understood love as work and work as ownership. A month after Grandpa's funeral, I finally opened the last box of belongings I had taken from the house. It contained family photographs, Grandma's recipe cards, several pieces of jewelry, and a few things that had belonged to my mother. One item was her old blue bathrobe. I had not seen it in years. I remembered her wearing it on weekend mornings while making coffee. The fabric was thin at the elbows. One pocket had a small tear along the seam. I washed it. Then I hung it over the chair beside my bed. That night I slept normally. The next morning the chair was empty. The robe had been folded into a compact rectangle and placed at the foot of my bed. Underneath it was Grandpa's hospital shirt, the one with the square cut from the sleeve. I was 18 when our cat died, and for years afterward I told myself that what happened in my parents' house was only grief mixed with habit. That explanation worked until my mother admitted she had been hearing the same things. By then, we had already sold the house. I grew up in a suburb outside Madison, Wisconsin, in a 2-story home my parents bought before I started kindergarten. It was built in the late 1970s and looked like hundreds of other houses in the area. Beige siding, dark shutters, attached garage, small front porch, maple tree near the driveway. Inside, the front entrance opened into a narrow foyer. The living room was on the left, and a dining room sat behind it. Straight ahead was the kitchen, with a small breakfast area facing the backyard. A short hallway beside the refrigerator led to the garage entrance and a laundry room. The stairs began near the foyer. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms. My parents had the room at the front, directly above the living room. Mine was at the back right corner overlooking the yard. My younger brother, Evan, had the room across from me. The bathroom was between our bedrooms, and a linen closet stood beside the staircase. The basement was unfinished, except for a small carpeted area where my dad kept an old television and exercise equipment. Our cat, Milo, knew that house better than any of us. My parents adopted him when I was 3. Technically, he was supposed to be my mother's cat, but that never meant much. Milo belonged to whoever had food. He was gray with a white chest, thick paws, and a small notch near the top of his left ear from an injury he had before we got him. He had absolutely no dignity where eating was concerned. He would ignore affection for hours, but if someone opened the cabinet where his food was kept, he could appear from another floor of the house almost instantly. By the time he was old, he had a routine. He spent most afternoons sleeping on my parents' bed. The mattress sat fairly high off the floor, so when somebody came through the front entrance, Milo would climb down in a very recognizable way. First, his front half landed heavily. A moment later, the rest of him followed. Then his claws made quick little contacts against the hardwood outside the bedroom as he headed for the staircase. We heard that routine thousands of times. The sound meant one thing. Someone was home, so Milo was going downstairs to see whether food might happen. He was 17 when his kidneys started failing. By then, I was in my first semester of college, about 2 hours away. My mother had been warning me for months that he was getting worse. I kept avoiding the subject. Milo had existed for almost my entire life. I knew intellectually that 17 was extremely old for a cat, but part of me had placed him in the same category as the house itself. Permanent. When Mom called on a Thursday afternoon and said the veterinarian thought it was time. I was sitting in the university library. She asked if I wanted her to wait until I came home the following day. I said no. I told her that would only make him suffer longer. That was true. It was also convenient. I did not want to be in the room when he died. I told myself I had classes. I told myself driving home just to watch him be euthanized would not help anybody. The real reason was that I was afraid. Mom stayed with him. Dad went too. My brother was away at school and could not get home. I remained on campus. For a while, I felt guilty about that in a way that was difficult to explain. I knew Milo was an animal. I knew he probably did not understand that I had chosen not to be there. Still, I kept thinking about how many times he had waited near the front door when I came home from school, or slept at the end of my bed when I was sick, or followed me around the house during bad thunderstorms. When his last day came, I stayed away because it was easier for me. My mother brought his collar home from the vet. It was blue nylon with a small silver oval tag. Milo was engraved on one side. Our phone number was on the other. She put it in the drawer of her bedside table. Nobody talked about it much afterward. The first strange incident happened less than a month later. I came home from college for Thanksgiving. The house felt wrong without Milo. That is probably obvious to anyone who has lost a longtime pet. His food dishes were gone. The litter box was gone. There was no gray shape sleeping in the sun near the dining room window. Yet every time I entered a room, some part of my brain still expected him to be there. On my first evening home, I walked into the kitchen carrying a glass of water. Something passed between my ankles. I stopped so suddenly that water spilled over my hand. There was nothing there. I looked down. Empty floor. I had felt fur, not air, not my pajama leg brushing against the other ankle. A solid, warm body had passed close enough that I instinctively widened my stance to avoid stepping on it. I stood there for several seconds. Then I laughed. Muscle memory. That was the phrase I used. My body was accustomed to having a cat underfoot. I went upstairs. A little later, while brushing my teeth, I heard something come down from my parents' bed. A heavy contact from their bedroom. A softer one immediately afterward. Then, quick movement into the upstairs hall. I looked out of the bathroom. Nothing. My parents were downstairs watching television. Their bedroom door stood open. I went inside. The bedspread was smooth. No animal, no object on the floor. I went downstairs and did not mention it. A few weeks later, my mother called me. She sounded normal at first. We talked about classes, money, and whether I planned to come home over winter break. Then she said, "Do you ever think you hear Milo?" The question caught me completely off guard. "What do you mean?" "Nothing, no. What do you mean?" She hesitated. "Sometimes I think I hear him jump off the bed." I sat up straighter. "Since he died?" "Obviously, how often?" "I don't know. A few times." I told her about Thanksgiving. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then, Mom laughed. "Guess we're both losing it." I laughed, too. That became our explanation. The house had contained Milo for 17 years. Of course, we heard him after he was gone. Our brains expected familiar noises. That winter, Dad announced that he and Mom planned to move. He had been offered a job in Minnesota, and with Evan already talking about college, keeping a large house no longer made sense. I hated the idea. I was surprised by how much I hated it. Losing Milo had already made home feel less stable. Now, my parents wanted to sell the place where I had spent nearly my entire childhood. I became irrationally angry. Mom reminded me that I lived at college most of the year. Dad pointed out that neither Evan nor I planned to settle in Madison. None of that mattered. The house contained every version of our family I could remember. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, arguments, Milo sleeping on the stairs, my brother throwing cereal at me across the kitchen table, Dad helping me build school projects in the basement, Mom sitting on the laundry room floor crying when her father died. It felt wrong that strangers would be using those rooms. Dad told me houses were not people. I knew that. I still resented him for saying it. The first event that left something physical happened in February. I returned for a long weekend to help my parents start sorting things. Mom and I spent Saturday packing books. Dad worked in the garage. That evening, I dropped a black sweater on my bedroom floor before taking a shower. When I came back, the sweater had moved. It was on the bed, not thrown there. Folded, Milo obviously had never folded clothing. That should have made the incident less connected to him. Instead, I thought immediately of the way he used to sleep on clothes left on the floor. He loved anything that smelled like us. The sweater was folded into a rough square, but the middle was depressed. There was a shallow oval in the fabric, about the size of a curled cat. I called Mom. She came upstairs. "Did you do this?" "No, Dad." "He's still in the garage." We both looked at the sweater. Mom reached out and touched the center. She pulled her hand back. "What?" "It's warm." I touched it. She was right. The room itself was cool. The center of the sweater felt as if something had been lying there. Not hot. Body temperature. Mom unfolded it. Several gray hairs were caught in the fabric. That gave me a strange rush of relief. Milo's hair. Mom did not answer. We both knew cat hair survives in homes for years. It gets into carpet, furniture, vents, storage boxes. Finding a few hairs proved nothing. Still, she placed them on a piece of white paper. The following morning, they were still there. Dad saw them. He thought we were being sentimental. Milo lived here 17 years. You'll probably find his hair behind the refrigerator when they tear the place down. He was right. What none of us could explain was the mark on the sweater. 4 tiny impressions had appeared near one edge. They looked like claw points pressed deeply into knitted fabric without actually tearing it. Mom photographed them. The sweater kept those marks permanently. I still own it. After that weekend, I started paying closer attention. The experiences were never dramatic. That was what made them easy to dismiss individually. I would walk into the kitchen and hear the food cabinet shift slightly. A bedroom door would move a few inches after I passed it. Once, I woke at my parents' house because something had settled near my feet. The mattress lowered. The blanket tightened around my legs. I knew the exact feeling because Milo had slept there when I was younger. I did not open my eyes. I lay completely still, telling myself that springs shift and people feel things while half asleep. Then the pressure moved. One slow step, another, a third. The weight traveled from the foot of the mattress toward my hip. My throat tightened. I opened my eyes. The bed was empty. The indentation beside my leg remained for several seconds before the mattress slowly rose. I did not tell anyone. By early spring, the house was listed for sale. That changed whatever was happening. The little signs became more frequent. Mom found cabinet doors open in the mornings. Not random cabinets, the one where Milo's food had been stored. Dad boxed up the old cat dishes from the basement. The next day, the stainless steel food bowl was in the kitchen. He accused Mom of taking it out. She accused him. Neither had. Dad wrote box 17 across the cardboard in thick black marker and put the bowl back inside. He sealed the box with packing tape. 2 mornings later, the bowl sat beside the refrigerator. Box 17 remained taped shut. Dad opened it. The place where the dish had been packed was empty. He stopped joking after that. His explanation became more careful. We're tired. That was all. We are tired. As if exhaustion could remove an object from a sealed container. A week later, my mother called me from the driveway. She had come home from work and heard something upstairs the moment she opened the front entrance. The familiar landing from the master bed. Then movement down the hall. She waited near the foyer. Nothing came down the staircase. She went up. The door to my old bedroom was open. Inside, the curtain moved even though the window was closed. She said she had the overwhelming sense that something passed by her knees. Then she found Milo's collar on my pillow. That shook her badly. The collar was supposed to be in her bedside drawer. She checked. The drawer was closed. Inside it was the small cloth bag where she had placed the collar. The bag was tied shut. Empty. Dad examined the bedroom when he got home. No one had entered the house. The alarm had been set. Doors locked. Windows secure. Mom put the collar back in the cloth bag. This time, she placed it in a locked metal cash box. Dad kept the key on his keyring. Neither of them told me what they had done until weeks later. The collar did not move again. For a while. The most disturbing visual experience happened to me during spring break. I came home for 5 days to help prepare the property for an open house. Most of the personal photographs were already packed. The walls looked bare. Rooms echoed more than they used to. Without our belongings, the place stopped feeling like my childhood home and started looking like something strangers could buy. I hated it. On my second night, I was sitting on the floor of my bedroom, sorting old-school papers. The overhead light was on. My door stood open. From where I sat, I could see part of the upstairs hall and the bottom section of the linen closet door. Something moved past, low to the floor. My first thought was cat. I stood quickly. The hallway was empty. Then I saw the carpet. Our upstairs hall had beige carpet with a short pile. A narrow section of fibers near the wall was pressed in the wrong direction. The disturbance moved, not because something visible touched it. The carpet itself changed in a line. A small patch flattened near the bathroom. Then another several inches ahead. Then another. Footfalls. I watched the pattern cross toward my parents' bedroom. I followed. At the doorway, the movement stopped. The bed had been stripped because the house was being staged. A plain white comforter covered the mattress. Near the center, a small depression appeared. Then another beside it. Something invisible climbed onto the bed. The surface lowered under 4 separate points. My stomach turned. I whispered, "Milo?" The mattress shifted again. For 1 second, I saw something. Not a normal, ghostly animal. Not a transparent cat. The air above the bed seemed folded. That is still the best description I have. The floral wallpaper behind the mattress had a repeating pattern of small blue leaves. In one cat-sized area, those leaves bent inward as though the wall itself had been pinched into the shape of an animal. The outline had shoulders, a rounded back, a head. Where the left ear should have been, the pattern broke around a small notch. Milo had a notch in his left ear. I could not breathe. The figure turned. There were no eyes, no face. Instead, the room behind it looked slightly displaced, like looking through thick glass. Then it jumped down. The wallpaper snapped back to normal. Something brushed my shin. I stumbled into the hallway. I sat on the floor and cried. Not from fear, at least not entirely. For the first time since Milo died, I felt as if I had been given something I wanted without admitting I wanted it. Proof that he had not simply stopped existing. I called Mom upstairs. I told her what I saw. She believed me immediately. That frightened me. I asked why she wasn't trying to explain it away. She sat beside me. Then she told me everything she had kept from me. The sounds had started within a week of Milo's death. She felt something jump onto the bed several times. She once found 4 small, damp impressions across the bathroom tile, even though no animal lived there anymore. Dad had heard scratching outside the bedroom door. Evan had felt something settle beside him on the sofa during Christmas break. Nobody told me because Mom knew I already felt guilty about not coming home when Milo was put down. You did what was best for him, she said. I wasn't there. He wasn't alone. I should have been. Mom took my hand. You don't owe the dead a perfect ending. I still think about that sentence. For a while, seeing the shape on the bed actually helped me. The guilt softened. I began talking about Milo without feeling ashamed that I had stayed at college. Then, the house sold. The closing date was set for June. As soon as that happened, the atmosphere changed. The presence stopped feeling comforting. Doors began resisting us, not slamming. A closet might refuse to open, then move easily 10 minutes later. A packed box would be dragged several feet from where we left it. Objects belonging specifically to Milo appeared in rooms we had already cleared. One of his old toy mice showed up beneath my parents' bed. Mom had thrown it away years before his death because the fabric had split. Dad found a cracked plastic scoop used for litter sitting on the basement steps. No one remembered keeping it. The blue collar came out of the locked cash box. Dad discovered that on a Wednesday morning. The box itself remained locked. He opened it with the key. The cloth bag was empty. The collar lay upstairs in the hall, stretched across the doorway to my parents' bedroom. The tag had fresh scratches across its surface. Dad put it on the kitchen table. We are taking this with us. Mom agreed. That surprised me. I thought she might want to leave it behind if Milo was somehow connected to the property. Instead, she said, he's ours. Dad placed the collar in his briefcase and took it to work so it could not move again. That night, the closet in my parents' bedroom opened by itself. Mom watched it. Nothing came out. The next morning, Dad's briefcase was on the kitchen floor. He had left it locked inside his car. The collar was gone. We found it under the bed. At that point, Dad wanted to bring a priest to the house. That was shocking, because my father had not attended church except for weddings and funerals since I was a child. Mom said no. She did not believe Milo was trying to hurt anyone. I agreed with her then. The final day changed my mind. The buyers were supposed to take possession Monday morning. Sunday afternoon, Mom and I went back to remove the last personal items. Dad had already left for Minnesota ahead of us because his new job had started. Evan was with friends, so it was just the two of us. By then, nearly every room was empty. The furniture used for staging had been removed. Our footsteps echoed through the first floor. We carried cleaning supplies, a small toolbox, trash bags, and 2 cardboard boxes. One box contained family papers. The other held things Mom could not decide what to do with. Milo's collar was inside that second box. She had found it again that morning beneath a folded towel in the linen closet. Neither of us questioned how it got there. We simply packed it. For most of the afternoon, nothing happened. We cleaned the refrigerator, wiped shelves, checked drawers, walked through each room making sure nothing remained. At around 6, rain began outside. The house grew gray as the daylight faded. Mom turned on lamps as we moved through the rooms. We finished upstairs last. My bedroom was completely empty. I stood in the middle for a while. There were lighter squares on the walls where posters had protected the paint. A faint scratch remained on the windowsill from when Milo tried to climb through a closed screen. I ran my hand over it. Mom waited in the hallway. "You ready?" "No," she smiled sadly. "Me neither." We went into my parents' bedroom. That was where Milo had spent most of his old age. The room looked enormous without furniture. We stood beside the place where the bed used to be. Mom started crying. Then I did. It wasn't only about the cat. We were saying goodbye to the house, to childhood, to a version of our family that would never exist again. Mom hugged me. I said, "Maybe he'll come with you." She knew who I meant. She laughed through tears. He hated the car. That made me laugh, too. For a moment, the room felt warm again. Then Mom said, "Come on, Milo, we're going." She said it the way she used to call him from upstairs before taking him to the vet. Nothing happened. We stood quietly. Then something landed on the bare floor behind us. A heavy front impact. A softer second contact. Mom's fingers tightened around my arm. We both heard it. Something moved across the empty room. We could not see anything. The boards responded under invisible weight. A small section near the doorway creaked. Then the hall. I whispered, "Milo?" The movement stopped. Mom opened the cardboard box. She took out the blue collar. The silver tag caught the ceiling light. "Come on, sweetheart." A low sound came from the hallway. Not a meow, more like a cat making a warning noise deep in its throat. Mom stopped smiling. We stepped into the hall. The air there was colder. The bathroom door stood open. My bedroom entrance was open. The linen closet was shut. At the far end, beside the stairs, the carpet began flattening. One small patch, then another. The invisible steps came toward us. I expected something to brush my legs. Instead, the collar jerked in Mom's hand. She cried out. The strap pulled hard enough to straighten. She held on. For several seconds, it looked like someone on the other end was trying to take it. "Let go," I said. "No, Mom, it's his." The collar pulled again. The metal buckle cut into her fingers. She finally released it. The blue strap flew across the hall. It landed near the top of the staircase. The silver tag slid several inches and stopped. We stared. Then the shape appeared around it, the same distortion I had seen on the bed months earlier, but larger. The carpet pattern drew inward, forming the rough outline of a crouched animal. At first, it looked cat-sized. Then, its back rose. The shape lengthened. It was still on 4 legs, but the proportions were wrong. Too long through the body. The shoulders nearly reached my knee. The head remained small. Where the face should have been, the wall behind it bent inward. The left ear still carried the familiar notch. That detail made it worse. It knew that detail. Or it had always had it. I do not know which possibility frightens me more. Mom whispered, "That's not Milo." The shape turned toward her. The house changed around it, not dramatically. The hallway seemed to compress. Patterns in the carpet pulled toward the thing's paws. The straight line of the baseboard curved slightly in its direction. Even the shadows under the door frames looked stretched. Then it moved. Fast, it struck Mom's legs. She fell backward into the bedroom. I grabbed her arm. Something caught my jeans below the knee. 4 sharp points pressed through the fabric. I kicked. The grip tightened. I could see nothing attached to me. Only the cloth pulling downward. I grabbed the doorframe. Mom got to her feet and wrapped both arms around my waist. Whatever had my leg began dragging me toward the stairs. My shoe came off. The carpet burned against my other ankle. I screamed. Mom pulled. The unseen claws tore through my jeans. Pain opened along my calf. I kicked again. My heel hit something solid. Not air. A body. The pressure released. We ran into my parents' room and tried to close the door. It stopped halfway. Something was between the door and frame. There was nothing visible there. Mom pushed with both hands. I joined her. The door moved another inch, then forced itself back. We stumbled. The warped cat-like outline appeared in the opening. The wallpaper pattern from the hallway ran through its body at the wrong angle. Its head tilted. Then it made the sound Milo used when he was frightened at the vet. A short, broken cry. My chest tightened. For 1 second, I almost stopped pushing. Mom did not. That is not him. She slammed her shoulder against the door. The shape squeezed through. Not by becoming thinner. The room around it bent. The edge of the door looked curved while it passed. Then, everything snapped back. The thing came toward us. I grabbed the only object left in the bedroom, a wooden curtain rod we had planned to throw away. I swung. The rod hit resistance. The impact traveled into my wrists. The outline jumped sideways. A section of wall paint tore away where its body passed. We ran. I had no plan except getting downstairs. The collar remained near the staircase. As I passed, I grabbed it. That was a mistake. The silver tag became ice cold in my hand. Something struck my back. I fell onto the top step. Mom caught the railing. The presence landed on me. I could not see it directly, but weight pressed between my shoulder blades. Far heavier than Milo had ever been. My chest hit the stair edge. Air left my lungs. Sharp points dug through my shirt. I yelled. Mom pulled at my arm. The pressure shifted. Then something moved beside my ear. I heard purring. Not comforting. Too slow. Each vibration felt as if it came through the wood of the house instead of an animal's chest. I dropped the collar. The weight vanished. The tag slid down 3 stairs. We ran. At the bottom, Mom went for the front entrance. The deadbolt turned. The door would not open. She pulled harder. I checked the chain. There was none. The knob worked. The frame simply held. Something moved upstairs. The familiar landing from my parents' old bed came from the empty bedroom. Then another, and another, more than one set. The sounds moved into the hall. Mom looked at me. Kitchen. We ran toward the back of the house. The sliding door to the yard was already unlocked. Mom grabbed the handle. It opened 6 inches. Then, stopped. I looked down. Nothing blocked the track. We pulled together. The glass panel moved another inch. Behind us, the kitchen cabinet opened, the one where Milo's food used to be kept. A metal bowl fell onto the floor. We had removed every pet dish months earlier. The bowl spun near the refrigerator. It was Milo's. The same stainless steel dish Dad had sealed in box 17. I knew it because there was a small dent along one side from when I dropped it as a child. The dish stopped spinning. Something invisible pushed it across the tile toward us. Mom started crying again. No, the cabinet slammed. A second cabinet opened. Then another. The kitchen filled with moving doors. Not all at once, one after another around the room. I grabbed a dining chair and hit the sliding glass door. Mom shouted my name. The first strike cracked it. The second broke a hole in the lower pane. Cold rain blew inside. Something rushed across the floor behind us. I felt fur against my bare ankle. Then, claws caught the back of Mom's sweater. She screamed. The fabric pulled tight across her throat. I turned and grabbed her. 3 long tears opened across the back of the sweater without any visible hand. The sound she made was not fear anymore. It was pain. I swung the chair into empty space. It struck something. The chair leg broke. For half a second, the distorted outline appeared beside the refrigerator. This time I saw one detail that had not been there before. Around the neck was a narrow band, not blue. The color kept changing depending on what stood behind it. Wallpaper, cabinet wood, dark window glass. But a small, oval shape hung beneath the throat. A tag. The silver tag from Milo's collar was still on the stairs. I could see it from the kitchen. Whatever stood in front of us had copied that too. Mom whispered, "Get out." I knocked the remaining glass from the sliding door. We climbed through. I cut my palm badly on the frame. Mom tore her sleeve. We ran into the backyard in the rain. Neither of us stopped until we reached the neighbors behind the house. They called the police because we said someone had broken into the property. 2 officers searched. No person was found. Every exterior entrance except the broken sliding door was locked. The upstairs windows were closed. The garage was empty. The basement was empty. There was nowhere for an intruder to hide. The physical damage was obvious. My jeans had 4 long cuts below the knee. Underneath, my calf was bleeding from matching scratches. My shirt had 3 tears across the upper back. Mom's sweater was ripped nearly from shoulder to waist. She had red pressure marks around her upper arms and a raw line across the front of her neck. The kitchen cabinet doors were all open. The metal cat bowl sat in the center of the floor. The sliding door was shattered. Upstairs, the bedroom paint had been scraped away in a long, curved patch near the entrance, and the carpet at the top of the stairs had been pulled partly free from the tack strip. One officer asked whether we had a large dog. We said no. He pointed toward the bedroom door. 4 gouges ran vertically through the wood. They were deep enough to expose pale material underneath. The spacing looked like claws. The next morning, our realtor came with a contractor. Both saw the damage. The contractor replaced the bedroom door and repaired the carpet. He asked several times what kind of animal had been inside. We told him we didn't know. The cat bowl remained on the kitchen counter until Mom threw it into an outdoor trash bin. Neither of us wanted to take it. We never found the blue collar. The police had seen the silver tag on the stairs during their first search. One officer mentioned it because he thought it belonged to a pet. By morning, it was gone. The house closed one day late because of the broken glass. Mom and I did not spend another minute inside alone. Dad came back from Minnesota. He helped with the final walkthrough. Nothing happened while he was there. The new owners were a young couple with a toddler. I never met them. I thought about warning them. Mom talked me out of it. What could we possibly say? Our dead cat may still be in the house. Except we are no longer sure the thing acting like him is actually a cat. We left. For the first few months in my parents' new place, Mom listened constantly. Every time a floorboard moved, she stopped. Every small noise from the bedroom made her look toward the stairs. Nothing followed us. No pressure on beds, no sensation around our ankles, no familiar movement after someone came home. Mom said maybe Milo had decided to stay where he knew everything. I wanted to believe that. Eventually, the fears softened into something sadder. I missed him again. Not the thing that attacked us. The actual cat. The lazy old animal who screamed for tuna and slept in laundry baskets. For years, I avoided telling this story because I knew what most people would say. We were emotional. The sale was stressful. We had spent months expecting to experience a dead pet. Maybe an animal got into the house. Maybe we panicked. I cannot explain the scratches that way. I cannot explain the bowl inside a cleared kitchen. I cannot explain how both of us saw the same distortion in the hallway. But I also cannot prove what we thought we saw. The house changed owners again about 12 years later. I only know because I became curious one night and searched the address. The photographs in the new listing were almost unrecognizable. The kitchen had been remodeled. The upstairs carpet was gone. The walls were painted gray. My childhood bedroom had become an office. My parents' old room had a completely different layout. I went through every photograph twice. Nothing unusual. I felt relieved. Then I reached the final picture. It showed the upstairs hallway looking toward the primary bedroom. The photo had probably been taken with a wide-angle real estate camera. Near the bottom edge, on the new hardwood floor, was a small gray shape. At first, I thought it was a cleaning rag. I enlarged the image. The shape was not lying on the floor. The floorboards inside it bent slightly out of line. There was a rounded back, 4 legs, a small head. The left ear had a notch. I closed the listing. I never looked at it again. Last month, my mother mailed me a box of childhood belongings she found while clearing her basement. Inside were school papers, photographs, old birthday cards, and the black sweater from that first winter after Milo died. The 4 tiny impressions were still in the fabric. I unfolded it. Something fell onto my kitchen floor. A small silver oval tag. One side said Milo. The other still had the phone number from our old house. There were fresh scratches across the metal. I'd been passed over for partner 3 weeks before Carol invited me out to her friend's place on the East End, and I said yes to that weekend, mostly because I didn't trust myself to spend 2 more days alone in my apartment rereading the email that had done it. I'd made partner track at that firm for 6 years, and the managing partner, a man who told me twice, in words specific enough that I'd repeated them to my own mother afterward, that the position was mine once he retired, had gone ahead and handed it instead to a colleague with half my tenure and, as far as any of us could tell, a considerably shorter memory for promises made to people who couldn't easily push back. I don't say any of this to complain about my career. I say it because I think it matters to what happened that weekend, because I arrived at that house already carrying a very specific, very fresh understanding of what it feels like to be promised something and then simply watch someone else decide, later, that the promise didn't need to count. My mother, on the phone the night before I left, told me a weekend away sounded like exactly what I needed, and asked, a little carefully, whether I was doing all right otherwise, whether I was sleeping, whether I was eating properly. I told her I was fine. The way you tell your mother you're fine when you've decided the alternative is more conversation than you have the energy for. And it was only driving out to the island the next morning, alone with 3 hours of empty highway and my own thoughts, that I let myself admit how far from fine I actually was, my hands tight enough on the wheel by the second hour that my knuckles had started to ache. Carol's friend was a neurologist named Peter, a big, easy-mannered man with a practice in the city and a family house. out past the vineyards on the island's far eastern end. A rambling shingled place built, he told us over dinner that first night, sometime in the 1880s. He told the story the way you tell a story you've told 100 times before, half performance and half genuine family lore, about the family who'd originally owned the house, promising the property to their longtime stableman on the old patriarch's deathbed, only for the surviving children to sell the whole estate out from under that promise the moment their father was in the ground. The stableman, a man named Thomas, had died himself not long after, and the household's maid, who'd apparently spoken up for him and paid for it with her own position, was said to have died in the house within the year. Neither of them, Peter said, grinning in the candlelight, had ever bothered to leave. He told the story with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once had to actually believe it, refilling our wine as he talked, and I remember Carol teasing him gently about how many times she'd heard this exact version over the years, word for word, right down to the same little pause he always left before the punchline about Thomas and Agnes never bothering to leave. Peter took the teasing well, the way people do about stories they've long since stopped worrying whether anyone actually believes. I remember laughing along with Carol at the story. The easy, comfortable laugh you give a good ghost story at a dinner table, and I remember too. A small, uncomfortable twist somewhere under my ribs that I didn't examine closely enough at the time to understand. A twist that had everything to do with a promise made to a man who worked hard and trusted the wrong people to honor it. The house itself was enormous. 3 full floors and a finished attic. A wide central staircase curving up from the front hall with a landing partway up where old stained glass caught whatever light was left in the evening. Peter had kept most of the original furniture, and the whole place had that suspended, out of time quality old houses sometimes get when nobody's had the heart to fully modernize them. He mentioned, showing us around after dinner, that the house had gone through one major renovation back in the 1950s, when his own grandfather had widened the main staircase and reworked the front hall to better suit the parties his grandmother liked to host. A detail that meant nothing to me at the time, and that I would find myself turning over very differently by the following morning. Carol and I shared the larger guest room on the second floor, and I remember lying awake later than either of us should have. Restless in the way you get restless in an unfamiliar bed, carrying a grievance you haven't found anywhere to put down yet, and it was somewhere in that in-between hour, not quite morning, that I woke properly to the sound of quiet, even footsteps on the stairs outside our door. Carol slept through all of it, that first night undisturbed beside me, and I remember lying there afterward, wondering whether I should wake her, deciding against it, telling myself there'd be nothing to actually show her even if I did. I got up, curious rather than afraid, and through the crack of the door I saw a woman descending, dark hair pulled back under a small white cap, an old-fashioned dress with a high collar and a starched white apron, an armful of folded towels held against her chest. My first thought, embarrassing in hindsight, was simple relief that Peter had thought to hire actual help for the weekend. The kind of easy, well-funded touch I associated with a successful neurologist who didn't think twice about spending a little extra on his guests. I remember thinking, half asleep, how nice that must be. To have people around who did exactly what they'd been asked, and nothing more. No complicated negotiations. No promises quietly revised after the fact. I watched her for a good 10 or 15 seconds before I lost sight of her past the turn of the stairs, long enough that if anyone had asked me the next morning to swear to what I'd seen, I'd have done so without a moment's hesitation. It was only lying back down that the detail that would keep me awake for the rest of that weekend actually surfaced in my mind, though I didn't understand yet why it bothered me. Her feet, descending those wide, gently curving stairs, hadn't followed the curve at all. She'd walked in a straight, narrow line, each step placed with the same even, unhurried cadence regardless of where the actual tread beneath her happened to be, so that on the outer edge of the staircase's curve, her foot had come down solidly on empty air a good 6 inches past where the step's surface actually ended, with no stumble, no adjustment, no acknowledgement at all that she'd just planted her weight on nothing. I fell back asleep, telling myself I'd imagined it, the way you tell yourself things at 4 in the morning, and woke properly an hour or so later needing water, and found her again, this time crossing the front hall toward the kitchen, an old-fashioned percolator held in both hands, steam curling up from its spout, though I couldn't imagine who'd have set a kettle going that early. She moved through the hall with that same unnervingly precise gait, and it was only watching her cross the wide floorboards near the base of the stairs that I noticed, fully awake this time, that her path ran at a slight diagonal to the room's actual layout, cutting a straight line across a corner where the current hallway had, at some point, clearly been widened, as though she were still walking a version of that room that no longer quite existed. I stood there long enough to watch her pass entirely out of sight through the kitchen doorway, and I remember, very distinctly, that not one single floorboard creaked under her weight the entire time. In a house where every other footstep, mine included, produced at least some small sound against those old boards. I went back to bed, unsettled but not yet frightened, and slept until the sun was properly up, coming downstairs to find Peter and Carol already at the kitchen table, coffee made from an ordinary electric machine. No sign anywhere of the maid or the percolator I'd watched her carry twice. I asked, casually, where the woman helping out had gone, assuming she was somewhere finishing breakfast, and Peter's face did something careful and still that I'd remember clearly for a long time afterward. He asked me what she looked like. I described her. The collar, the apron, the particular fixed forward set of her eyes that I only now, saying it out loud, realized had never once blinked in either of the times I'd watched her. Not once, in the several long seconds I'd had her in view both times. Peter listened without a word, his face going carefully blank in a way I recognized, even then, as the particular stillness of someone deciding how much of what they actually knew they were prepared to say out loud. Then he got up and led me into the front sitting room to a wall of old photographs and pointed to a small, formal portrait near the bottom of the arrangement. "That's her," I told him, and he said in a voice that had lost every trace of the easy dinner table performer from the night before that the woman in that photograph had been dead for right around 100 years. I want to be honest that I laughed. At first, the same nervous, disbelieving laugh you'd give any story too strange to fully accept on the spot. The kind of laugh that comes out before your body is finished catching up to what you actually just heard. Carol laughed along with me, a shade too quickly, and Peter didn't laugh at all, standing there in front of that photograph with his hands in his pockets, like a man waiting to see how much more we needed to be told before we'd actually believe him. It was later that same day, walking the property with Carol while Peter took a work call, that the laughter properly ran out of me. We'd wandered out past the gravel turnaround where the old stable had once stood. Nothing left of it now but a slightly uneven patch of ground and a low, half-buried stone foundation line you'd only notice if you were looking for it, and I felt, crossing that patch of ground, a cold that had nothing to do with the mild afternoon. A cold that seemed to come specifically from the ground itself rather than the air. Sharp enough that I actually stopped walking. And Carol, a few steps ahead of me, asked what was wrong before she'd even turned around to see my face. She told me afterward that she'd felt nothing at all standing in that exact same spot, which somehow unsettled me more than if she'd felt it too, as though whatever waited under that ground had looked us both over and decided, specifically, that I was the one worth noticing. I didn't tell her, that first afternoon, about the particular thing I felt standing there, a pressure against my chest that felt uncomfortably close to the same pressure I'd been carrying around for 3 weeks already. The specific, private ache of being promised something by someone with the power to give it, and then watching them decide, quietly, that the promise simply didn't apply once it became inconvenient. I told myself it was projection, my own bruised feelings finding a ghost story to attach themselves to, because ghost stories are easier to be afraid of than your own career. Carol asked me twice more that afternoon whether I was all right, and both times I told her I was just tired. A lie I'd gotten so practiced at telling people back in the city that it came out of me in that cold field without any real effort at all. I brought a stack of case documents with me that weekend, foolishly, thinking I might use some of the quiet time to draft an appeal to the partnership committee. A formal request that they honor what I'd been told rather than what they'd since decided suited them better. I'd printed everything the night before I left. Every email, every note I'd taken after each conversation with the managing partner over the past 2 years, a whole folder's worth of evidence that I'd been promised something specific and had every reason to believe it. I left the folder on the desk in our guest room Saturday afternoon while Carol and I went for a walk into the nearest town and came back to find it moved, not far, just shifted a few inches to the left, squared up with an obsessive, unnatural neatness against the desk's edge that I certainly hadn't left it in, every page inside restacked in an order I didn't recognize. I didn't sleep well that second night, and somewhere well past midnight, unable to lie still any longer, I got up and went down to the kitchen for water, taking the back stairs this time rather than the main staircase, a narrower, plainer flight that Peter had mentioned, almost offhand at dinner, used to be the servants' way up and down before the house's last major renovation, decades earlier. Carol was fast asleep beside me, and I remember pausing at our bedroom door, listening to her steady breathing, deciding not to wake her for something as small as a glass of water. A small, ordinary decision I've since gone over more times than I can count, wondering how differently that night might have gone if I'd simply woken her and asked her to come down with me instead. I hadn't planned on taking that particular route. I'd meant to go down the main stairs the way I had the night before, but something about the memory of that woman's foot planted on empty air kept pulling my attention toward the narrower, plainer door at the far end of the landing instead, the one Peter had mentioned so casually at dinner, and I told myself, climbing down those steps in the dark, that I was simply curious, that there was no harm in seeing where the old servant's route actually led. I understand now how foolish that reasoning was. At the time, half asleep and still turning my own professional grievance over and over in my head, it felt like nothing more than mild curiosity. I felt the cold before I saw anything. That same sharp, ground-deep cold I'd felt out by the old stable foundation, and at the bottom of those narrow stairs, blocking the doorway through to the kitchen, stood a man. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, in the particular way of someone who'd spent a working life handling animals rather than a desk. Dressed in rough, dark work clothes, gone stiff and pale with what looked, even in poor light, like a fine crust of old frost, his exposed hands and face carrying the same crusted white sheen, not skin so much as skin remembered by cold, cracked in fine lines the way frozen ground cracks in a hard winter. His eyes, when they found mine, held none of the maid's fixed, unblinking stillness. They were entirely present, entirely aware, and entirely coldly furious. I noticed, in the single frozen moment I had to notice anything at all, that his hands hung slightly curled at his sides, fingers held in the particular loose, permanent curve of someone who'd spent decades gripping leather reins. A shape his hands seemed to have kept even 100 years after the last rein he'd ever held had rotted to nothing. He didn't speak, I don't think. In the time I stood frozen on those stairs, he needed to. He simply extended one hand toward me, slowly, and I felt the temperature in that narrow stairwell drop hard enough that my own breath came out in a visible cloud, and some old animal part of my brain understood, with total clarity, that whatever grievance had kept that man tied to this particular staircase for 100 years had just decided I was close enough, finally, to do something about it. I turned and ran back up, and he came after me. Not with footsteps, but with that same spreading, deepening cold, chasing me up those narrow stairs faster than any grown man his size should have moved. And I felt his hand close around my ankle just as I reached the top step. A grip that didn't burn the way I might have expected from everything I'd read about ghosts as a kid, but bit, sharp and immediate, the specific pain of skin coming into contact with something colder than it has any business surviving contact with at all. I kicked free, stumbled into the upstairs hallway, and slammed the stairwell door shut behind me, breathing so hard I thought I might actually be sick. I remember pressing my back flat against that closed door, sliding down it until I was sitting on the floor, my whole body shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the actual temperature of the hallway around me. Carol found me sitting against that closed door 10 minutes later, and by the time Peter came to check what all the noise had been, my ankle had already started to swell, a ring of blanched, frost-pale skin circling at exactly where I'd felt that grip. Skin that stayed numb to the touch for nearly 2 full days afterward. Cold no matter how long I held it under warm water. A mark our family doctor back in the city would later describe, uncertainly, as consistent with a minor case of frostbite, an explanation none of us had any good way to reconcile with a mild weekend in late spring. Peter told me that night, sitting with me at the kitchen table while Carol wrapped my ankle in a warm towel, that he'd never personally seen either Thomas or Agnes himself, not once, in all the years he'd owned that house, and that some part of him had started to wonder, watching the marks rise on my skin, whether that was simply luck, or whether the house had always been waiting for someone who'd arrive already carrying the right kind of grievance to actually get its attention. He said it slowly, testing the idea out loud as much as offering it to me, and I remember thinking, even through the pain in my ankle, that he sounded genuinely frightened for the first time since I'd met him, all his easy dinner party confidence gone quiet. He told me, too, something he said he'd never mentioned to another guest before, that he'd found, going through his own mother's papers after she'd passed a few years earlier. An old estate ledger with a final entry in the original patriarch's hand, instructing that the eastern parcel of land, the parcel that had held the stable, be deeded outright to Thomas in recognition of loyalty beyond any fair wage, an instruction his own children had apparently simply set aside once their father was gone. Selling the property whole to a buyer who'd never known any promise had been made at all. He showed me the ledger itself the next morning, the ink gone brown with age, but the handwriting still firm and legible, a dying man's last clear instruction that his own family had quietly decided wasn't worth honoring. I asked him, unable to help myself, even with my ankle still throbbing, whether he'd ever considered doing anything about it now, all these years later, some symbolic gesture, a plaque, a donation in Thomas's name, anything that might function as the kind of correction the man had never gotten in life. Peter was quiet for a long moment before admitting that he'd thought about it more than once over the years, and had always talked himself out of it, telling himself there was nobody left to actually give anything to. No descendants he'd ever been able to track down, no proper channel for making right or wrong that old. Sitting there with my ankle wrapped in a towel, I told him that not having a proper channel had never once stopped my own former employer from deciding a promise no longer applied. And he didn't have much of an answer for that. Carol barely spoke on the drive back into the city Sunday afternoon, and it was only somewhere past the halfway point, both of us staring straight ahead at the highway, that she admitted she'd felt something herself that weekend, too. Something she hadn't wanted to mention in front of Peter. A cold, watching pressure in the guest bathroom, the first night that she'd talked herself out of taking. Seriously, until she'd seen the state of my ankle for herself. She kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror the rest of the drive, she admitted later. Checking without quite meaning to that I was still actually there beside her, and not somehow left behind at that house after all. She said she didn't think she'd go back to that house again, not because she didn't love Peter, but because some part of her understood, now, that whatever lived there wasn't interested in being a charming dinner table story anymore, if it ever really had been. I left that Sunday with my ankle still faintly numb and a folder of case documents I could no longer look at without a small, unpleasant lurch in my stomach. Restacked, I noticed on the drive home. In an order that made no sense according to any filing system I'd ever used, the pages themselves faintly, persistently cold to the touch for the rest of that week, cold enough that I eventually gave up trying to work from them at all and had my assistant print a fresh set. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that Sunday night, staring at that folder without opening it, and finally sliding it into the back of a filing cabinet drawer rather than throwing it away outright, unable to fully explain to myself why I couldn't quite bring myself to destroy it either. The numbness in my ankle took the better part of 2 weeks to fully resolve, and for most of that time I found myself avoiding stairs at work whenever I could reasonably take the elevator instead, a small, private superstition I never explained to any of my colleagues. My assistant asked once, noticing me wince getting up from my desk, whether I'd hurt myself on vacation, and I told her I'd twisted it walking on some uneven ground, which was true enough not to feel like an outright lie. I did end up bringing my case to the partnership committee the following month, laying out plainly what I'd been promised, and by whom, sitting across a long conference table from 4 partners who listened with the particular careful, unreadable attention lawyers give each other when nobody wants to be the first to reveal how the conversation is likely to go. I won't pretend the story has the tidy ending you might want it to have. They heard me out. They made no promises about reversing anything already decided. What they did do, a few weeks later, was quietly restructure the terms of the position they'd already given away. Adjustments that happened to benefit me more than anyone bothered to explain. A small, unacknowledged correction that nobody involved has ever directly connected, out loud, to anything I said in that meeting. My compensation shifted. My client list expanded in ways that positioned me, according to 2 separate colleagues who mentioned it to me privately, for the next available partnership slot whenever it opened. A slot that had never existed, as far as anyone could tell me, before that particular quarter. I don't know how to explain that outcome, and I've stopped trying to, the same way I've stopped trying to explain a folder of documents that stayed cold to the touch for a full week after a weekend spent in a house I have never gone back to since. Carol tells me, when we talk about that weekend at all, that she thinks something in that house simply recognized a wrong it understood intimately and decided, in whatever limited way a 100-year-old grievance can decide anything, to nudge the scales very slightly back in favor of someone who reminded it of itself. I don't know if I believe that. I don't entirely disbelieve it either. I think about that cold, cracked hand more often than I'd like to admit, especially on the coldest nights of winter, when my own ankle aches faintly in a way no doctor has ever been able to properly explain. And I think, too, about how strange it is that the one detail from that whole weekend nobody in Peter's family has ever managed to account for isn't the maid at all. With her unblinking eyes and her feet planted on stairs that no longer exist, but a single line, still legible after nearly a century, in an old man's dying hand, promising a piece of ground to someone his own children decided, later, wasn't worth honoring after all. Peter still calls sometimes, checking in the way old friends of friends do. And he mentioned to me not long ago that he'd finally hired a genealogist to try tracing whether Thomas had left any family behind at all. Any line of descendants who might still exist somewhere to actually receive whatever gesture he'd been turning over in his mind all these years. He hasn't found anyone yet, he told me, a little wryly, that he wasn't sure whether he hoped the search would succeed or not, since some part of him had started to wonder whether the house's whole arrangement, whatever kept Thomas and Agnes there after 100 years, depended on that debt staying permanently, deliberately unpaid, and that finding an actual person to pay it to might unsettle the house in ways none of us could predict any better than. We'd predicted my own ankle. I haven't been back to that house since, and I don't think I will be, though I still think, some winter nights, about a man with hands curled into the permanent shape of reins he hasn't held in a century, still waiting, somewhere in that cold ground, for someone to finally make good on what he was owed. I was 9 when my grandfather died and left my dad the house, a tall Victorian terrace on a steep street in Liverpool, 5 floors if you counted the cellar and the old servant's attic at the top, and I was 10 the year my parents finally separated, and my dad moved the two of us into it properly. My sister going to live with my mum across the city while I stayed with him. A decision none of us ever fully explained to me at the time beyond the vague, practical language adults use when they've already decided something and don't want to be argued with. I remember feeling, that whole first year, like I'd lost 2 homes at once. The flat I'd grown up in and the easy, unremarkable version of my family that had existed before, and being handed instead this enormous, echoing old house that never once felt entirely like mine, no matter how many of my own things I unpacked into it. The house had been in my dad's family for 3 generations, built sometime in the 1850s, tall and narrow the way those old terraces always are, a cellar kitchen below street level, a ground floor with a parlor and dining room nobody used, 2 floors of bedrooms above that, and right at the top, under a steeply pitched roof, a low, cramped set of rooms that had once housed servants and had been used for nothing but storage in my grandfather's lifetime and, as far as I knew, in his own father's before him. Every one of those 5 floors had its own fireplace, most of them boxed up or plastered over decades before I was born. All of them, as I would eventually learn, sharing the same network of old brick flues that ran up through the walls of the house like a second hidden staircase nobody used anymore. My own bedroom sat on the 2nd floor, at the front of the house overlooking the street, with my dad's room just along the landing and the bathroom between us. The stairs down to the ground floor at the far end of that same landing. And it was along that particular stretch I would come to realize that almost everything strange in our lives that year eventually happened. My dad was not, by any stretch, a man who enjoyed a joke at anyone's expense, least of all mine, which matters a great deal to what I'm about to tell you, because it meant that when strange things started happening in that house, I never once had to wonder whether he was simply having me on. He was quiet by nature, practical, the kind of man who fixed things himself rather than calling someone in, and grief, and the months after my grandfather died, seemed to make him even more closed off than usual, as though he'd decided the best way through losing his own father was to keep himself busy, with the endless small repairs an old house like that always needed. I understood, even at 10, that some of his quietness that year belonged to my grandfather and some of it belonged to my mum, and that I was meant to be patient with all of it, without anyone quite explaining why. The first strange things were the kind you could explain away without much effort. Footsteps on the stairs at hours when both of us were meant to be in bed. Easy enough to blame on an old house settling the way old houses do. A voice, once low and indistinct, that I heard coming from the empty dining room while I was upstairs doing homework, which I told myself afterward must have been the television left on somewhere, though I could never quite work out which room it would have been coming from. Small things. The kind of things you fold into the ordinary strangeness of a big old house and don't think too hard about, especially when you're 10 years old and more interested, most days, in what's for tea than in whatever might be creaking 2 floors above you. I remember one evening in particular, sitting at the kitchen table doing my homework while my dad cooked, hearing what sounded unmistakably like 2 people talking in low voices somewhere above us, though there was nobody else in the house and both of us were accounted for right there in the kitchen. My dad paused with the wooden spoon in his hand, listening too, his shoulders going still in a way I noticed even at 10 years old, and then went back to stirring the pot without comment. And I understood, even then, that his silence on the matter wasn't him failing to notice so much as him deciding, for my sake, not to make more of it than he had to. It was the soot that first made me pay proper attention, though it took me a long while to understand that's what I was even looking at. I started finding fine black dust on my windowsill some mornings, a thin, even layer of it, the kind of dust you'd expect from an old coal fire rather than the gas central heating my grandfather had installed decades before I was born. I mentioned it to my dad once, and he frowned at it, ran a finger through it, and told me it was probably just years of grime finally working its way loose from the old chimney breast behind the wall, the kind of thing that happens in houses this age when nobody's touched a flue in 50 years. I believed him, mostly because I wanted to, and because the alternative wasn't something a 10-year-old has any good language for yet. I started keeping a rough count of the mornings I found it, without ever quite deciding to, the way you keep track of something worrying without admitting to yourself that's what you're doing. Some weeks there was nothing at all, and I'd let myself relax a little, convinced whatever had caused it before had simply stopped. Then it would appear again, sometimes just a faint dusting, sometimes, on the worst mornings, a clear line of it tracked across the carpet from the direction of the boarded-up fireplace toward my bed, as though something had crossed the room while I slept and left a trail behind it, the way a person leaves footprints in fresh snow. The night everything changed, my dad and I were alone in that whole 5-story house together, my sister at my mum's for the week. And I remember it clearly, because it was the first time I'd been properly, uneasily aware of just how large and how empty most of that house actually was, around the 2 small occupied rooms we slept in. I always slept with my bedroom door closed. That was simply how I liked it, a habit from years before we'd ever moved into that house, and it had never once occurred to me to question it, until the night I woke to find it standing wide open, the dark landing beyond it visible from my bed in a way it never usually was. My dad had checked on me himself before he went to bed that night, the way he'd started doing most evenings, and had pulled the door shut behind him the way I always asked him to, which meant that whatever had opened it again in the hours since had done so quietly enough that neither of us had heard so much as a creak of the hinge. I lay there for a moment, confused rather than afraid, working out whether I'd simply forgotten to shut it properly. And it was in that moment of confusion that I became aware I wasn't alone in the room. There was a shape at the foot of my bed, tall, far taller than any person had any business being. Close to 7 feet if it had been standing on an ordinary floor rather than looming the way it did. And my first instinct, the instinct of a child raised on ordinary scary stories, was to think shadow. Some trick of light in half sleep, except shadows don't have texture. And this did. Its surface wasn't smooth darkness, the way I'd have expected. It moved constantly, in small, shifting increments, like a held breath of black dust suspended in the air, rather than a solid shape, fine particles drifting from its edges and settling, soundlessly, onto my carpet the way ash settles after a fire's gone cold. I could see, even in that dim light, faint threads of gray moving through the black of it, curling and dispersing the way smoke curls through still air, and where its face should have been there was only a deeper, denser knot of that same drifting dark. No features I could name, just the suggestion of a head tilted slightly toward me. Watching, I remember thinking, absurdly, that it looked the way the inside of our old fireplace looked whenever my dad cleared out the grate, that same fine, drifting blackness, except upright and aware, and looking directly at me. I don't know how long I lay there frozen before it noticed I was awake. I only know that the moment it did, the moment that dense, faceless knot of black seemed to fix itself in my direction, its whole shape began to lose its edges all at once, the fine, drifting particles at its outline suddenly pouring downward in a rush, like sand through the narrow part of an hourglass, collapsing into the carpet at the foot of my bed until there was nothing left standing there at all, just a settling drift of fine black dust on the floor where it had been. In the same instant, my bedroom door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the frame, and I lay there in the sudden dark, unable to make a single sound. My whole body locked rigid with a fear I didn't yet have any name for. I remember, once I finally found the nerve to move, reaching for the lamp on my bedside table, with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and sitting there in that small pool of electric light for what felt like hours, staring at the closed door, waiting for morning the way you wait for a train you're afraid might not actually come. I told my dad everything the next morning, the open door, the tall, dark shape, the way it had seemed to pour itself into the floor. He listened without interrupting, in the careful, serious way he listened to most things, and when I asked him outright whether he'd been in my room in the night, he told me plainly that he hadn't, that he'd been asleep in his own room the entire night. And I believed him completely, because my dad was not a man who found any humor in frightening his own child, and because the flat, slightly unsettled way he answered told me he was taking the question far more seriously than a joke would have required. He sat with me at the kitchen table for a long while that morning, not saying much, just staying close in the quiet way he had of showing he was worried without making a fuss of it. And eventually he told me, a little stiffly, that he'd never once experienced anything like what I was describing himself, but that his own father, my grandfather, had mentioned once or twice over the years, always in passing and never with much detail, that the house had its odd moments, and that he'd always simply told my dad, as a boy, to pull the blankets up and ignore it. Advice my dad now seemed to realize. Sitting across from his own frightened child had never actually been very good advice at all. He reached over and squeezed my shoulder once, briefly, an unusual gesture for a man who wasn't naturally demonstrative, and told me that whatever happened from here, I wouldn't be facing it on my own, the way he apparently had. He did mention, almost reluctantly, that he'd found a similar dusting of black grime on the landing carpet outside my door that same morning, in a rough, uneven patch that looked, he said before catching himself, a little too much like it had been tracked there by something walking rather than simply settling out of the air. I didn't sleep well for weeks after that, and I started sleeping with my door propped slightly open on purpose. Some instinctive bargain I made with myself that an open door might be easier to live with than one that could be forced shut again from the other side. The soot kept appearing, more often now, thin drifts of it along the skirting boards in my room, in the hallway outside once. Memorably, in a rough, sooty smear across the bathroom mirror that neither my dad nor I could account for, that wiped away easily enough, but left the glass beneath it faintly, permanently clouded no matter how hard he scrubbed at it afterward. My dad started coming up to check on me most nights around then, a habit neither of us named directly, but that we both understood the purpose of. Standing in my doorway for a moment before bed, asking if I was all right. And I think, looking back, that those quiet check-ins did more to make that year bearable than anything else either of us said out loud. He never once suggested I was imagining things, and he never once made a joke of it either. And I've come, as an adult, to appreciate how much restraint that must have taken from a man who was also quietly frightened in his own right, in a house he'd only just inherited from a father he was still actively grieving. It was my dad, of all people, who first went looking into the house's history, driven more by his own need to understand what was happening in a house he'd only just inherited than by anything I asked of him directly. He spent a couple of evenings after work up in the attic that spring, going through boxes of my grandfather's old papers that nobody had touched since the funeral. And he found, in a battered tin box that had clearly sat undisturbed for decades, old deeds, a handful of Victorian photographs of the house's original owners, and, tucked at the bottom, a small bundle of newspaper clippings my grandfather had apparently kept, for reasons he'd never once explained to anyone still living. The clippings were old, brittle, dated from the 1860s, and told in the clipped formal language of the period of a boy named Sam Higgins, a climbing boy of perhaps 8 or 9 years old, employed by a local sweep to work the chimneys of houses on our street, who had become lodged in the flue of the very house we now lived in and died there before he could be freed. The article noting with a kind of detached Victorian primness that such accidents, while regrettable, were an unfortunately common hazard of the trade. There was no mention of which flue, no further detail about what became of his body afterward, beyond a brief note that it had eventually been recovered. And my dad read that clipping to me at the kitchen table, with a stillness in his voice I'd never heard from him before. The stillness of a grown man trying very hard not to let a child see how badly something had rattled him. He told me, folding the clipping carefully back into its original creases as though it might crumble apart if he wasn't gentle with it, that he wished his own father had simply told him the whole story years ago rather than leaving it for him to stumble across in a tin box after he'd already died. And I remember thinking, even at 10, that there was a particular kind of loneliness in that admission. A man missing his father freshly enough that even a piece of unsettling family history felt like something he'd have rather had the chance to hear from him directly, sitting across a kitchen table, the way he was now telling it to me. Knowing that didn't stop anything. If anything, the weeks after we found those clippings were worse than anything before them. The footsteps grew more frequent, no longer confined to odd hours, but sometimes audible even in daylight, moving through walls in a way that made no sense until my dad pointed out, quietly, that they always seemed to travel along the same vertical line through the house, the exact path. We both understood, without saying it aloud, that the old shared chimney flue took from the cellar all the way up to the attic. I stopped going down to the cellar kitchen alone that spring, even in daylight, because more than once, standing at the bottom of those stairs, I caught the smell of an old coal fire freshly lit, sharp and acrid, in a room that had held nothing but a disused boiler and stacks of my grandfather's unsorted boxes for as long as I'd been alive. My dad smelled it too. On the one occasion, I finally convinced him to come down and check with me, and he stood very still in that cellar doorway for a long moment before telling me, in a voice that wasn't quite steady, that we'd go together from now on. An offer I don't think either of us ever actually needed to take him up on again, because I simply stopped going down there at all. Around that same time, my dad started noticing something himself that he only told me about years later, once I was old enough that he no longer felt he needed to shield me from every detail. He said that some evenings, sitting alone in the front parlor after I'd gone to bed, he'd hear what sounded like a child coughing somewhere above him, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to come from inside the wall itself rather than from any room, and that it always stopped the moment he stood up to go check on me, as though whatever made it had been listening for his footsteps just as closely as he'd been listening for its cough. He never told me about that at the time, worried, I think, that hearing it might make the whole thing feel even more real to a 10-year-old already struggling to sleep through the night. And I understand now, as an adult myself, exactly why he made that choice, even if some part of me still wishes we'd been able to be frightened together rather than each of us carrying a slightly different piece of it alone. I asked my mom about that whole period once, years later, curious whether my dad had ever said anything to her at the time, given that she and my sister were living apart from us through most of it. She told me, a little reluctantly, that he had mentioned it. Once, in a late-night phone call, she'd mostly put down to the stress of losing his own father so recently, and that she'd worried at the time whether the two of us were coping as well as he kept insisting we were. I don't think she ever fully believed the version of events I later told her myself, though she never said so outright, and I've learned not to push the subject with her much further than that. It's strange, looking back, how differently that single year sits in each of our memories, my dad's, my mom's, my own, three separate accounts of the same house that barely seem to describe the same place at all. The confrontation, when it came, happened almost 2 months after that first night. On another evening, my dad and I were alone in the house, my sister once again away at my mom's. I woke to that same wrongness in the room, the sense of a held breath before it happens, and found not just the door standing open, but the shape already at the very foot of my bed, closer than it had ever come before, tall enough that its indistinct head brushed near the ceiling. And this time, instead of simply watching, it reached for me. I remember, even through the fear, some small, useless part of my mind still trying to work out how something with no visible legs, nothing beneath it but that same drifting, settling dust, could have crossed the width of my room without a single sound. Its arm extended in a way that shouldn't have been possible for something without any visible joints. A long, tapering shape unspooling from its side the way smoke unspools from a chimney on a still day, and I felt, rather than saw fine, gritty particles brush across my exposed ankle where my duvet had slipped, cold and dry and horribly textured, like being touched by a handful of fine cinders rather than any hand. I scrambled backward off the bed, hitting the floor hard on the far side, and it moved toward me rather than retreating this time, the whole dense mass of it flowing low across the carpet with a speed nothing that size should have had. And I remember screaming for my dad with a rawness in my throat I'd never used before, a sound that didn't feel entirely like my own voice by the time it left me. He was through the door within seconds, and whatever he saw in that half-lit room, he never fully described to me afterward, beyond telling me, much later, that he'd seen enough drifting black shape crossing that carpet toward his own child that he hadn't needed a single further second of convincing about anything. He grabbed me under the arms and hauled me bodily out into the hallway. And behind us, I heard that same rushing, pouring sound, sand through glass, and the door slammed shut on its own before either of us had touched it. We sat on the landing floor together for a long time after that, my dad's arms still tight around me, both of us breathing hard. And I don't think either of us said a single word until the sky outside the landing window had properly started to lighten. My ankle, where it had brushed against me, carried a fine, sooty stain for almost a week afterward that no amount of washing would properly lift. The skin beneath it faintly gray, no matter how hard I scrubbed, fading at last only gradually, the way a bruise fades rather than the way dirt washes away. My dad took a photograph of it on the second day, quietly, without making a fuss, and told me only much later that he'd wanted some kind of proof, for his own sake, as much as mine, that he hadn't simply imagined the whole business himself out of grief and stress and too little sleep. My dad had the chimney breast in my old room opened up properly, not long after that, paying a builder to break through the old plastered-over fireplace that had sat sealed behind a thin skin of lath and plaster since long before either of us had been born. The builder, a gruff, practical man who I don't think believed in much beyond what he could put a level to, came down from my room after an hour looking noticeably paler than when he'd gone up, and told my dad, in a lowered voice he probably thought I couldn't hear from the kitchen below, that he'd never in 30 years of this work found a flue quite that cold. Colder, he said, than any disused chimney had any business being on a mild spring afternoon. Inside the flue itself, not far up from the hearth, he found a small leather boot, cracked and stiffened with age, child-sized, along with a scattering of small bones the police were eventually called in to examine. Confirmed, after a lengthy process my dad shielded me from most of the details of, to be consistent with a child roughly the age Sam Higgins would have been. They were removed and, as far as I know, eventually given some kind of proper burial, arranged quietly by my dad rather than any official process. A small service he attended alone one weekday morning while I was at school. Something he only told me about years later, almost embarrassed by how much it had seemed to matter to him at the time. Laying to rest a boy neither of us had ever known in life, but who had, in some strange way, become part of our own small family's grief that year. For a while after that, the house did seem to settle, the footsteps growing rarer, the soot no longer appearing on my windowsill the way it once had. I moved out for university eventually, and my dad still lives in that house today, older now, more inclined to talk about that period of our lives than he once was. My sister moved back in with us herself, in the end, once our parents had settled into their new arrangement properly, and I've always wondered, though I've never quite worked up the nerve to ask her directly, whether she ever noticed anything odd in that house herself during the years she stayed there afterward, or whether whatever it was had simply finished with what it wanted from our family by the time she came back. She's never once brought it up unprompted, which I've come to think means either that she never experienced a single strange thing in that house, or that she's decided, the same way my dad once did with me, that some things are easier to carry alone than to hand to someone else. He mentioned to me, on a visit home not long ago, that he'd had the whole chimney breast in my old childhood bedroom properly rebuilt and replastered years ago. A clean, modern finish with no trace of the old opening left at all. And that just last month, dusting the mantelpiece in a room that has had no working fireplace in it for over a decade, he found. Sitting on the clean white paint of that sealed-up breast, a single, fine handprint in soot. Small enough, he said, in a voice that didn't quite manage to sound as offhand as he meant it to have belonged to a child. He told me he'd wiped it away himself before he could think too hard about it, and that he still hadn't decided whether he regretted doing that so quickly, or whether some part of him simply hadn't wanted to spend one more night in that house with it still there to look at. I am still not someone who tells people I believe in ghosts. That is probably the first thing I should say. I believe people misremember things. I believe old wiring behaves badly. I believe buildings settle. Pipes make strange noises, radios can pick up interference, and frightened teenagers are excellent at convincing one another that something ordinary is dangerous. I also know what happened to me when I was 14. I have never found an explanation that covers all of it. This happened at a small Catholic junior high outside Pittsburgh in the late 1990s. The school itself was not one building. The main section was a rectangular brick structure from the 1950s with classrooms, a gym, cafeteria, and offices. Attached to it by a covered passage was a much older building. Everyone called it the parish house, even though no priest had lived there in decades. It had been built in the 1880s as a residence for clergy. Later, several nuns lived there while teaching at the school. By the time I attended, most of the rooms had been converted into storage spaces, music practice rooms, offices, and classrooms used when the main building was full. It still looked like a house. That mattered. The front door opened into a narrow entrance hall with an old staircase rising along the left wall. A former sitting room had become the guidance office. The dining room was used for faculty meetings. The kitchen still existed at the rear, although the appliances had been removed except for an old sink. Upstairs, the original bedrooms had become small classrooms. There was also a second staircase near the back, much narrower than the main one. It began beside the old kitchen and came up next to a linen closet on the second floor. Students were not supposed to use it. The first floor coat room was near that rear staircase. It had probably once been a pantry or servant's room. It was longer than it was wide, with hooks along one wall and wooden shelves on the other. During winter, students stored boots there. Lunch boxes went on the upper shelves. Sports equipment, lost clothing, and cleaning supplies collected in the corners. The room had one narrow window facing the side yard. It also had an old tabletop radio. Nobody knew why. It was rectangular, brown plastic, and probably from the 1970s. There was a tuning dial across the front and a silver antenna that never stood completely straight. I had seen it for years. I never heard anyone use it. I ended up in that coat room because I got into a fight. Not a serious fight. Another student named Brendan Walsh had been making jokes about my father. My dad had died the year before. He worked for a delivery company and was killed when a truck crossed the center line during heavy rain. There was no mystery around his death. A driver lost control. Two vehicles collided. My father died before paramedics got him out. I was 13. The difficult part for me was that Dad and I had argued the morning he died. I had been caught skipping a homework assignment. He took away my Nintendo for the weekend. I called him unfair. He told me I was becoming lazy. I said something along the lines of, maybe don't come home tonight. 14-year-old me later treated that sentence like a curse. I knew it had not caused anything. Knowing did not help. For months afterward, I replayed the argument. Then I became defensive whenever anyone mentioned Dad. Brendan knew that. One day in religion class, he made a joke about my father not being around to punish me anymore. I hit him. He hit me back. A teacher separated us. We both got detention and had to help clean different areas of the parish house after school for a week. On the third day, Brendan was absent. Sister Catherine, who supervised us, paired me with another student named Lucas Bell. Lucas was quiet, smart, and the kind of kid teachers trusted. We were told to clean the coat room. This mostly meant clearing the shelves, throwing away abandoned food containers, sorting lost clothing, and wiping dust from the wooden surfaces. Sister Catherine gave us trash bags, paper towels, and a spray bottle. Then she left. The parish house felt different after school. During the day, you could hear footsteps, doors, teachers talking, bells, and students moving through the covered passage. After 3:30, most of that stopped. The building became noticeably residential again. The furnace clicked beneath the floors. The rear staircase creaked. Every sound traveled farther. Lucas and I started at the bottom shelves. We found gloves, scarves, one broken umbrella, several lunchboxes nobody had claimed, and an incredible number of pencils. Nothing unusual happened for the first 20 minutes. Then all the lunchboxes fell. There were maybe 12 of them on the upper shelf. Plastic ones. Soft insulated bags. One old metal box. They came down at almost the same time. Not gradually. The whole row dropped forward. 2 hit Lucas. 1 clipped my shoulder. Everything crashed onto the floor. We both jumped back. Lucas said, "What did you do?" "Nothing. You hit the shelf." "I didn't." He checked. The shelf was solid. There was no loose bracket. We decided one of us must have bumped it without noticing. That was the reasonable answer. We put everything back. A few minutes later, the radio came on. It started with static, not very loud. We both turned. The radio sat on a waist-high shelf near the door. A burst of music came through. Old music. I could not identify the song then, and still cannot. There were strings, maybe a trumpet, and a male singer. It played clearly for several seconds. Lucas walked over. "Did you turn that on?" "No." He touched the volume knob. The music became louder. That surprised both of us. The radio was working exactly like a powered radio should. I remember thinking someone must have left it switched on. Lucas crouched. Then he looked at me. The power cord was wrapped around the back. The plug was not in an outlet. He held it up. The music continued. That was the moment my body reacted before my brain did. The hair on my arms lifted. Lucas dropped the cord. The station dissolved into static. Then the radio went silent. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Finally, I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. I turned it around looking for batteries. There was no battery compartment, only the power cord. Lucas said, "Put it down." I did. We left the coat room and found Sister Catherine in the faculty room. She thought we were trying to get out of detention. Lucas explained what happened. I expected him to sound embarrassed. He didn't. He was pale. Sister Catherine came with us. The radio did nothing. She checked the cord. Unplugged, she turned the dial. Nothing, she plugged it into the wall. It worked. A local talk station came through immediately. She unplugged it. "Silence, old electronics can hold a charge," she said. I knew almost nothing about electronics. That explanation sounded good enough. Lucas asked how long. Sister Catherine said she didn't know. We put the radio back. She stayed while we finished. The lunch boxes did not fall again. The next day, the priest came into the coat room. That sounds much more dramatic than it was. Father Michael was the parish priest. He was in his early 40s, liked baseball, and had a habit of drinking coffee during morning announcements. Sister Catherine had apparently told him about the radio. He joked with us. "So I hear you've got a DJ." Lucas did not laugh. Father Michael looked at the shelves, checked the outlet, and asked whether either of us had been playing a prank. We both said no. He took a small bottle of holy water from his pocket. I thought he was joking again. He wasn't. He made a short prayer near the doorway and sprinkled a little water inside the room. Then he said, "There, now you can finish cleaning without inventing excuses." That made Sister Catherine laugh. I laughed too. Lucas didn't. I remember feeling better. Not because of the blessing. Because adults had turned the whole thing into something small again. The school week ended. I assumed the story was over. Then the radio showed up in my house. Not the same radio. That would have been easier. My father had owned a little portable AM/FM radio he kept in the garage while working on things. It was black plastic with a carrying handle and one cracked corner. After he died, most of his tools remained exactly where he left them because my mother could not bring herself to sort them. The radio stayed on a shelf above his workbench. Our house was a two-story colonial in a neighborhood about 15 minutes from the school. The garage was attached on the right side. From the garage, a door led into a mudroom. The mudroom opened into the kitchen. The basement entrance was beside the pantry. Upstairs, my mother had the front bedroom. My younger sister, Kate, slept across the hall. My room was at the rear, above the kitchen. Dad had used a small spare bedroom beside mine as an office. After his death, Mom kept the office closed most of the time. One Saturday morning, I went into the garage looking for a basketball pump. Dad's radio was playing, a baseball broadcast. The volume was low. I stood near the workbench listening. The announcer was talking about the Pirates. I recognized the station because Dad listened to it constantly. That made the moment emotional before it became strange. For maybe 5 seconds, I simply stood there thinking about him. Then I noticed the cord. It hung from the shelf. The plug lay on the concrete. I stared at it. The broadcast continued. I touched the radio. The sound stopped instantly. Not gradually. No static. Just silence. I stepped away. The garage felt colder than the kitchen, even though it wasn't winter. I checked the back. Battery compartment. Empty. I called Mom. She came out annoyed because she was cleaning. I showed her the unplugged cord. I told her what happened. She looked at the radio for a long time. Then she asked, "Were you listening to his station?" "Yeah." Her face tightened. "Don't do that." I didn't. I mean, don't start making this into something. That made me angry. I'm not. You've been having a hard time. I know what I heard. I'm sure you heard something. That was worse. I left. Later, she apologized. We did not talk about the radio again. For about a month. Then little things started happening in Dad's office. The room had a desk facing the window, 2 filing cabinets, a bookcase, and a short leather couch. His coat still hung behind the door. Mom used the filing cabinet occasionally for bills. Nobody spent time in there. One evening, I walked past and heard a radio tuning through stations. That sliding hiss where voices appear for a second and disappear. The office door was closed. I opened it. Nothing. There wasn't even a radio in the room. I checked the computer speakers. Off, I went downstairs. The sound started again above me. Mom heard it that time. She looked toward the ceiling. "What is that?" I said nothing. She walked upstairs herself. The office was quiet when she opened it. For the first time, she looked worried. The next morning, an envelope was lying on the desk. It contained one of Dad's old pay stubs. Mom had stored those in a filing cabinet. The drawer was still locked. She had the key. She blamed herself. I must have taken it out. The date on the pay stub was the day before Dad died. That bothered me. Mom put it back. The following night, something knocked several items from my bedroom shelf. Not one or two. Everything, books, trophies, CDs, a small lamp. I woke to the crash. Mom ran in. We turned on the light. Nothing had broken except a plastic picture frame. The strange part was the direction things had fallen. The shelf was mounted above my desk. If it failed, objects should have dropped straight down. Several had landed almost 6 feet away near my bed. The brackets remained firmly attached. Mom picked up the picture frame. Inside was a photo of Dad and me at a baseball game. The clear plastic had cracked across my face. Not his. I told Mom I wanted to sleep downstairs. She said yes immediately. That frightened me more than if she had argued. The next day, she called an electrician. He checked outlets in my room, Dad's office, and the garage. He found nothing dangerous. I asked about radios playing while unplugged. He said some old sets could briefly produce sounds through stored electrical charge or unusual radio frequency conditions. I asked if they could play for several seconds with no batteries. He shrugged. Electronics do weird stuff. That became my preferred explanation. I repeated it whenever anything happened. Electronics do weird stuff. The phrase worked until Lucas came to my house. We had become friends after detention. One Friday, he came over after school to work on a science project. We were in the dining room. My mother was at the grocery store. Kate was upstairs. At around 5, Lucas heard something in the garage. He stopped talking. "You have that radio here?" I knew what he meant immediately. "No, the one from school." "No." We both listened. Faint music came through the mudroom door. The same old style of music we had heard in the coat room. I didn't recognize the song. Lucas did. His face changed. "That's it." "How do you know?" "Same singer." We went into the kitchen. The sound grew clearer. It came from the garage. I opened the mudroom door. Dad's radio sat on the workbench. The cord hung down. The male singer continued. Lucas did not enter. "Is that plugged in?" "No, I crossed the garage." The station began fading in and out. Then a voice came through. Not an announcer. A man's voice. Low, close to the microphone. He said, "Back room." Lucas whispered. "No," the radio hissed. Then, "Back room." I touched the power knob. Nothing changed. I turned it all the way to off. The voice remained. "Back room." Lucas grabbed my arm. "Let's go." Something struck the wall behind us. A metal wrench fell from Dad's pegboard. Then another tool. Then 3. They dropped one after another. We ran into the kitchen. The garage radio cut out. At the same moment, a door upstairs opened. "Kate called, Mom?" I shouted for her to come downstairs. She appeared at the top of the staircase. Behind her, Dad's office door stood open. She said, "Were you in there?" "No, somebody was." Lucas and I looked at each other. I asked what she saw. She said a man. Not clearly. She had walked toward the bathroom and noticed someone sitting on the office couch. She assumed it was me at first. Then the person turned. Kate ran. She could not describe the face. She only remembered something strange around the sides of his head. Like what? She pressed both palms over her ears, like circles. That meant nothing to me then. It would later. Mom came home 10 minutes later. We told her everything. She checked the office. Nobody. She checked the garage. Tools on the floor. The radio unplugged. She called my uncle. He came over and searched the entire house. Basement, closets, attic access. Garage, backyard, no person. He thought Kate had seen a shadow. He thought Lucas and I had scared ourselves because of the school incident. I wanted to believe him. That weekend, Mom packed most of Dad's office. She said it was time. I knew she was frightened. She boxed documents, old clothes, books, and photographs. Some went into the basement. Some into the garage. She donated the couch. The office became almost empty. The activities stopped for several weeks. Then I got suspended again. That sounds unrelated. It wasn't, at least emotionally. Brendan made another comment about Dad. This time I didn't hit him. I shoved his desk. It fell. The teacher saw. 3 days out of school. Mom was furious. We had our worst argument since Dad died. She told me I could not keep using grief as an excuse to lose control. I accused her of erasing Dad from the house. She said cleaning his office was not erasing him. I told her she seemed relieved he was gone. The second the words left my mouth, I wanted them back. Her face changed. She did not shout. She only said, "Go upstairs." I spent the rest of the afternoon in my room. Around 7, I heard the radio. Not in the garage, under my bed. Music came through the floorboards. I got down and looked underneath. Nothing. The sound stopped. Then it started inside the wall behind my headboard. A different station. Talk radio. Static. Music, several seconds of silence. Then a man speaking. I could not make out the words. I opened the bedroom door. The sound shifted into the hallway. Dad's old office was open. I had watched Mom close it earlier. Inside, something moved near the window. I thought it was the curtain. Then, the shape turned. A man stood beside the desk. He was not transparent. He did not look dead. He wore dark trousers, a white shirt, and an old gray cardigan. His hair was short and combed to one side. He looked maybe 50. The unusual part was his ears. He did not have any. Where each ear should have been was a shallow circular depression about 3 inches wide. The skin formed narrow concentric pleats, like the paper cone inside an old speaker. Both circular hollows pulsed gently, inward, outward, inward, as though reacting to a sound I couldn't hear. I stopped breathing. The man looked at me. His face was ordinary. Tired eyes, thin mouth, slightly crooked nose. The speaker-like folds beside his head kept moving. He raised one hand, not toward me, toward the office wall. The radio noise came from inside it. He pressed his palm against the plaster. The static became louder. Then he said something. His mouth moved. I heard the words through the wall behind me. Your father came home angry too. I ran. I nearly fell down the stairs. Mom was in the kitchen. She saw my face and stood. What happened? I told her there was a man upstairs. She grabbed the phone. We went outside. Police came. They found no one, no open windows, no damaged locks, nothing missing. One officer asked if I had fallen asleep. I had not. Mom did not mention the radios. I did not mention the man's ears. After the police left, she told me I could sleep in her room. I refused. I slept on the living room couch with every downstairs light on. Around 2 in the morning, the garage radio started. Mom heard it. She came downstairs. We stood in the kitchen together. The garage door was closed. The radio played a baseball broadcast. Dad's station. Then the announcer said a date, not the current date. The day Dad died. Mom went pale. The broadcast continued. A game recap. Weather, traffic, we both knew it could not be live. Mom opened the garage door. The radio was unplugged. She walked over and pulled the entire cord off the shelf. The sound continued. Then Dad's voice came through. Not a recording I recognized. He said my name. I started crying immediately. Mom covered her mouth. The voice said, "Don't make her carry it." That was all. The radio shut off. Mom sat on the garage step. I cried harder, not because I believed Dad had spoken, because I wanted to. That was worse. I told Mom I was sorry for what I had said. She hugged me. For the first time, I told her how much guilt I still carried over the argument the morning he died. She listened. Then she told me something I had never known. Dad had called her that afternoon from work. He told her about our argument. He felt bad for being too hard on me. He planned to bring home pizza and give me the Nintendo back early. Mom had not told me because she thought it would make me sadder. Instead, hearing it removed something that had been sitting inside me for more than a year. My final conversation with Dad had been ugly. his final thoughts about me had not been. I slept beside Mom that night. Nothing else happened. For almost 3 months, the house was quiet. School was quiet, too. I finished the year. Lucas and I stopped discussing the coat room. Then, on the last week before summer, Sister Catherine asked me to help move boxes from the parish house. I almost said no. I didn't want her asking why. Several students were helping. That made it easier. We carried old textbooks from the second floor to a dumpster outside. Around 4, everyone else left. Lucas had gone home. I was waiting for Mom to pick me up. Sister Catherine asked if I could bring one final box from the coat room to the faculty room. I agreed. The old house was nearly empty. I crossed the back hallway. The coat room door was open. The radio still sat on the shelf. That surprised me. I thought someone would have thrown it away. The power cord was coiled beside it. I ignored the radio and picked up the cardboard box. Something rattled inside. Lunch boxes, old ones being donated or discarded. I lifted the box. The coat room door closed behind me. I set the box down. The handle would not turn. I pulled. Nothing. I called for Sister Catherine. No answer. The radio came on. Static, I backed away from it. The tuning needle moved on its own. Slowly across the dial, station after station passed. Voices, music, white noise. Then silence. The man appeared in the narrow window, not outside, reflected in the glass. He stood behind me. I turned. Nothing. The window reflection still showed him. His speaker, like ear hollows, pulsed harder. The shelf above the lunchboxes bent downward. Everything on it dropped. Plastic containers hit the floor around me. I covered my head. The radio began playing the same old song Lucas and I heard during detention. The reflected man moved closer. I looked over my shoulder. Still no one. In the glass, he was only a few feet behind me. Then a hand grabbed the back of my school shirt. Real pressure. I shouted. The fabric tightened against my throat. I reached behind me. My fingers hit an arm. Solid. Warm. I could not see it. The invisible grip dragged me toward the rear wall of the coat room. There was an old built-in cupboard there, deep enough for hanging coats. Its door opened. Darkness inside. I grabbed the edge of a shelf. The radio volume climbed. The man's voice came through the speaker. Back room. I kicked backward. My shoe hit something. The grip loosened. I tried the main door again. Still stuck. The invisible hand caught my collar. This time, it pulled upward hard enough that my feet nearly left the floor. I grabbed the radio and swung it behind me. It hit something. There was a solid crack. The pressure released. The radio flew from my hand and smashed against the floor. The plastic case split. Inside, I saw wires, a speaker, and circuitry. No battery, no hidden power source. The man became visible, not fully, only in pieces. His gray cardigan, one shoulder, half his face. Those folded circular hollows where ears should have been. He stood between me and the door. The skin inside the left depression vibrated with the radio's static, even though the radio was broken on the floor. I grabbed the metal lunchbox nearest me and threw it. It struck his chest. He staggered. The cupboard behind me slammed. Something caught my wrist. 5 fingers. I could not see the hand. It pulled me sideways. I hit the shelf. Wood cracked. One corner drove into my shoulder. I screamed. Then Sister Catherine opened the door from the hallway. The instant she did, everything stopped. The man disappeared. The grip vanished. The broken radio lay on the floor. Lunchboxes were everywhere. I fell. Sister Catherine called for help. Father Michael came from the main school. So did the custodian. They found a torn collar on my shirt, deep red marks around my wrist, and a cut on my shoulder where the shelf had broken. The cupboard door was damaged. One hinge had partly pulled out. The shelf itself had a fresh crack through the wood. The old radio was in pieces. Father Michael picked up the back panel. He looked inside for several seconds. Then he asked, "Was this plugged in?" I said no. The cord was still coiled on the shelf. Sister Catherine confirmed that. I told them somebody had grabbed me. The custodian searched the old house. Nobody. Father Michael did not ask me whether I had seen a ghost. He only said, "You don't need to come back in this building." That afternoon, he blessed the coat room again. I know because Sister Catherine told my mother. The school removed the radio. I never learned what they did with it. The broken shelf remained until the parish house was renovated years later. The bruises on my wrist lasted 9 days. My mother photographed them. The marks looked like fingers. There was also one strange physical detail on my shirt. The collar had not torn straight. 5 small circular indentations were pressed into the fabric near the back seam. Each was ringed by tiny parallel ridges. Sister Catherine saw them. So did Mom. Nobody could explain what made them. I finished junior high and went to a public high school. Life became normal. Mostly, Dad's garage radio never played by itself again. Mom eventually donated it. I asked her not to tell me where. I stopped getting into fights. That was partly because I grew up. It was also because I finally understood how much of my anger had been grief looking for somewhere to go. Years passed. I studied engineering. That probably tells you something about how badly I wanted the world to make sense. I learned more about electronics. I asked professors about unpowered radios. Crystal radios can work without conventional power under the right conditions. Strong local transmitters can induce signals. Capacitors can hold charge briefly. Audio equipment can behave unpredictably around interference. All true. None of those explanations cover the entire story. They explain pieces. I am comfortable with pieces. I would rather say I don't know than pretend certainty. The parish house was renovated about 15 years after I left school. The old coat room became part of an administrative suite. I only know because Lucas sent me photographs from the parish website. We had stayed loosely in touch. He wrote one line beneath the link. They finally killed the radio room. I called him. We laughed about how terrified we had been. Then he became quiet. He asked whether anything ever happened at my house. I had never told him about the man. I asked why. Lucas said that after the detention incident, he began hearing radios in his own house too. Only for a few months. Always unplugged equipment. An old alarm clock. Computer speakers. Once a toy walkie-talkie with no batteries. He never saw anyone. Then his family moved. It stopped. I asked whether he remembered the man from the coat room. He said, "What man?" I didn't explain. That difference bothers me. If we had both seen the same figure, maybe I could call it shared fear. He saw none of that, only the radio. About 4 years ago, my mother sold our old house. I helped clear the garage. By then, Dad's tools were mostly gone. The pegboard was still there. I removed it because the buyers wanted the wall bare. Behind the pegboard, written directly on the drywall, was a date. Dad's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. It was not the date he died. It was 3 months earlier. Underneath, he had written, "Radio in office again. Not plugged in." I stood there for a long time. Mom had never seen that note. Neither had I. There was another line lower down, partly hidden by one of the old mounting brackets. I had to remove the bracket to read it. Heard someone behind coat closet. We did not have a coat closet in the garage. We had one inside the mudroom. I checked it. Empty. Mom wanted to leave. I almost did. Then I noticed a narrow crack in the drywall behind where the pegboard had been. It was vertical and too straight to be normal damage. I pushed gently. A small rectangular section moved inward. There was a shallow cavity behind it, maybe 4 inches deep. Inside was a brown plastic radio knob. Old, round A white tuning line painted across the top. I knew where I had seen it before. It matched the missing knob from the radio I smashed in the parish house when I was 14. I never touched it. Mom saw it too. We called the realtor and told him there was debris in the wall that needed removing. A contractor came the next morning. By then, the cavity was empty. My younger brother Sam died in a car accident 8 months before I took the caretaking job. And I mention that up front because I don't think I would have taken a position living alone in a 6-bedroom house in rural Vermont, hours from anyone I knew, if I hadn't already been looking for a reason to be somewhere that didn't remind me of him at every turn. He'd been 3 years younger than me, and the accident had been the kind of senseless, ordinary tragedy that leaves you angry at nothing in particular, an icy road, a driver who never saw him until it was too late. My parents wanted me close to home that first year. I wanted, more than anything, to be somewhere that didn't have his old bedroom 2 doors down from mine, and when Gary mentioned the Vermont house at a company gathering that same week, offhand. The way you mention any available perk, I said yes before I'd let myself think it through properly. My company's founder, a man named Gary Kessler, owned the place as a kind of investment property. Something he'd picked up years before at what he always called a steal of a price, and he offered it to employees willing to relocate and keep an eye on it as a housing perk, rent-free in exchange for basic upkeep and simply being present. I took it that same week, packed what little I still cared about into my car, and drove north without giving myself much time to think too hard about what I was actually running from. My mother called twice that first week, worried. In the careful way she'd been worried about everything since Sam died, whether I was doing all right out there completely alone, and I told her I was fine, which felt true enough at the time, before that house had given me any real reason to doubt it. The house itself was large in the particular way old New England farmhouses get large, additions stacked onto additions over more than a century. 6 bedrooms spread across 2 upper floors, 4 bathrooms, a full basement I rarely had reason to visit, and an attached 2-car garage with its own unfinished attic space above it. I lived almost entirely on the first floor, my bedroom converted from what had once been a study, my computer set up in the old dining room where I did most of my remote work, and I made a point, those first couple of months, of treating the upstairs the way you treat a museum wing that's closed for renovation, something to walk past rather than into. The first floor suited me fine that way. It had everything I actually needed: a kitchen, a small sitting room with a wood stove, and enough quiet that I could go whole days without needing to think about the rest of the house at all. Gary had mentioned, almost in passing when he showed me around, that the second floor had a few unfinished spots. A walk-in closet off one of the bedrooms that connected through to the garage attic, never properly finished out. No insulation. No real flooring beyond bare subfloor. No light fixture installed. He said it in the tone people use for boring, practical details. The kind of thing you mention because it's true and not because it matters, and for the first 2 months of living there, it didn't matter to me either. I heard the ordinary sounds an old house makes settling through a change of season, and I thought nothing more of it than that. It started properly with winter, the way these things so often seem to. The temperature dropped. The old radiators in that house began their nightly clanking and ticking, and somewhere underneath all of that ordinary noise, I started hearing something else. Small bumps and bangs coming from directly above the dining room where my computer sat. Soft enough at first that I genuinely believed. For a couple of weeks that I was hearing squirrels or raccoons that had found their way into the space above the ceiling, a reasonable enough explanation for an old house in the country in winter. I mentioned it once to a neighbor down the road, an older man named Walt, who plowed my driveway that first winter and seemed to know the general shape of every property within 10 miles. And he laughed and told me that old farmhouses always had something living in the walls come winter, squirrels or mice looking for warmth, and that I'd get used to the sound soon enough. I wanted very badly to believe him, and for those first couple of weeks, I did. Walt had grown up 2 towns over and had plowed that same driveway for the family before Gary ever bought the place. And I remember thinking, months later, once I knew the full story, that he must have known considerably more about that house than he'd let on that first afternoon, standing at the end of my driveway in his heavy canvas coat, laughing off my questions with the easy confidence of a man who'd decided long ago that some things were simpler left unsaid to a new arrival. The bumps grew more distinct over the following weeks, less like something small scurrying and more like something considerably heavier, shifting its weight, and by early December I was hearing what I could only describe, honestly, as footsteps. A slow, deliberate pacing back and forth across the floor of the second story, directly above my head. At hours when I knew for absolute certain I was the only living person in that entire silent house. I went up to check, more than once, telling myself each time that I'd find some ordinary explanation. A loose shutter banging in the wind, a branch scraping the roof, something a flashlight and a little patience would resolve. I never found anything. What I did notice on my second or third trip up that winter was that the door to that unfinished walk-in closet, the one connecting through to the garage attic, stood open, though I distinctly remembered it being shut the last time I'd been up there, checking on things back in the fall. I stood in that doorway for a long moment that first time, flashlight beam cutting a thin path across the bare subfloor and into the dark of the garage attic beyond, and I remember telling myself, quite firmly, that I must simply have left it open myself and forgotten. The kind of small self-deception that feels perfectly reasonable in October and considerably less reasonable by December. Once the pattern had repeated itself often enough that forgetfulness alone could no longer account for it. I shut it that night and locked it. An old-fashioned skeleton key lock that had come with the house and that I'd never once had reason to use before. I want to be honest that locking that door made me feel better for exactly 2 nights. There's a particular short-lived comfort in doing something concrete about a fear you can't otherwise explain. Turning a key and hearing it click, and telling yourself, for however briefly it lasts, that you've actually solved something. I slept better both of those nights than I had in weeks, and I remember thinking, foolishly, that the worst of it might simply be over. On the third night, the footsteps came again, and this time they had a clear, traceable path, moving from the direction of that same unfinished closet across the hallway to the second-floor bathroom, and then stopping entirely, the kind of abrupt, complete silence that feels louder than the sound it replaces. I lay awake in my downstairs bedroom for a long time after that, listening to nothing, waiting for some further sound that never came. My hand resting on the phone on my nightstand as though I might actually call someone, though there was nobody I could have called at that hour who wouldn't have simply told me to go back to sleep. The worst part, the detail I've never been able to explain to anyone who hasn't lived through something like it themselves, was the door itself. It would not stay locked. I'd go up in the morning and find the skeleton key turned, the door standing open a few inches, though I'd locked it myself the night before and kept the only key I knew of on my own keyring the entire time. I tried a padlock next, a solid hardware store deadbolt I installed myself with a hand drill, and within a week I found that padlock hanging open on its hasp, the shackle clearly unlocked rather than broken, as though someone with the actual key had simply opened it and left it dangling. I remember standing there staring at that open padlock for a long time, running through every possible explanation: a manufacturing defect, my own forgetfulness, anything at all that didn't require me to accept what I was actually looking at, and finding each time that none of those explanations held up under any real scrutiny. I called Gary about it eventually, more out of frustration than any real expectation that he'd have an explanation. And he was quiet on the phone for a long moment, long enough that I actually checked whether the call had dropped, before telling me, carefully, that he supposed I should know the house's full history, a version of events he admitted he probably should have shared with me before I ever moved in. He told me the family he'd bought the house from, years before I'd ever heard of the place, had a teenage son named Danny who'd been helping his father finish out that same closet space one weekend, running electrical for a light fixture through the unfinished subfloor connecting to the garage attic, and had fallen partway through a section of floor that hadn't yet been properly framed, dropping down into the garage itself below. He hadn't died instantly. Gary said the family had never fully recovered from it, had stopped all work on that section of the house entirely, and had sold the place within 2 years, at a price low enough that Gary, newly successful and looking for an investment, had jumped on it without asking too many questions about why. I asked him, once I'd gotten past the initial shock of hearing it, why he'd never mentioned any of this before offering me the house, and he was quiet again for a moment. That same heavy, hesitant quiet, before admitting, a little defensively, that he hadn't wanted to scare off a good hire over what he'd always assumed was simply a sad story, rather than anything that actually mattered to day-to-day living there. I didn't have much of a response to that at the time. I've had a great deal more to say about it since. Knowing that didn't make the door behave any better. If anything, the weeks after that phone call were worse. I pushed my old bed frame up against that closet door myself, wedging it firmly enough into the frame that I genuinely believed, for a few months, that I'd finally solved the problem through sheer physical force rather than any lock. The door did stay shut after that, physically blocked from swinging open, and for a while I let myself believe the worst of it was over. Those few months were, I'll admit, some of the calmer weeks of that whole winter, calm enough that I actually started sleeping through the night again. Calm enough that I let myself half believe the whole business had simply run its course. I'd still find it unlocked, though, the skeleton key turned from its locked position to unlocked, despite the bed frame still braced firmly against the door itself. An impossible little detail that unsettled me far more than the door standing open ever had, because it meant whatever was doing this didn't actually need the door open to prove a point. It only needed me to know it still could. I started checking that key every single morning, part of a small, unhappy ritual alongside making coffee, and I remember the particular sinking feeling each time I found it turned. A feeling that never once got easier, no matter how many mornings I lived through it. The footsteps spread through the rest of the house as that winter wore on, no longer confined to the space above the dining room, but moving freely across both upper floors, sometimes directly overhead while I worked, sometimes distant, on the far side of the house, always at a pace too slow and too deliberate to be anything but a person walking, though I was, every single time, entirely alone in that house. I started keeping a small notebook by my computer that winter, noting down the date and rough time whenever I heard something, a habit I'd picked up somewhere without quite deciding to, and looking back through it later, I noticed the sounds had a pattern to them I hadn't registered at the time. Always worse on the coldest nights. Always quietest on evenings when Walt or some other neighbor had been by earlier in the day, as though whatever moved through that house preferred me properly alone before it made itself known. There was a particular kind of horror, One I don't think I've ever fully communicated to anyone who's asked me about that winter. In standing in the shower on an ordinary Tuesday morning, steam fogging the glass, and hearing distinctly through the closed bathroom door a soft, rhythmic tapping moving up and down the hallway outside, patient, unhurried, the sound of knuckles or fingertips trailing along a wall as someone walks its length and then walks back again. I learned to shower with the water running as loud as it would go, some instinctive attempt to drown out a sound I couldn't stop myself from listening for anyway. I started timing my showers to the sound, too, without quite meaning to, waiting for a lull before I'd finally step out, standing dripping and cold by the door some mornings, straining to hear whether the hallway had actually gone quiet or whether I'd simply lost the tapping under the noise of my own breathing. The thump came in February, on a night cold enough that the whole house seemed to contract around itself. Old joints creaking under the temperature dropped the way they always did, except this thump had nothing to do with contracting wood. It came from directly above my bedroom, a single, heavy impact, loud enough that a book slid off my nightstand from the vibration of it. And there was no further sound after it at all. No footsteps, no explanation, just that one enormous thump, and then a silence that stretched on so long I eventually convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, right up until I found, the next morning, a fine crack running through the plaster ceiling directly above where my bed sat. A crack that hadn't been there the day before, and that a contractor, Gary, sent out that spring could offer no structural explanation for at all. The contractor, a practical man who spent most of his visit talking about insulation and settling foundations, stood under that crack for a long moment near the end of his inspection, running his hand along it, and told me, almost reluctantly, that whatever had caused it, it wasn't the kind of stress crack he'd expect from normal settling, that it looked more like the ceiling had taken a single sharp impact from directly above rather than gradually shifting over time. He didn't have any further explanation to offer, and I didn't push him for one, though I noticed he seemed in less of a hurry to go up to the second floor himself than his easy manner downstairs would have suggested. It was near the end of that same February that I finally went up to confront whatever was happening directly, driven more by exhaustion than courage, tired of losing sleep to a house that seemed determined to keep reminding me it was in charge of its own noises, regardless of what I did about locks or bed frames. I'd reached a point, by then, where the ordinary fear of the unknown had started to matter less to me than simple exhaustion. The particular grinding fatigue of months spent listening for footsteps that never quite explained themselves. And some reckless, worn-down part of me decided that whatever waited behind that door, at least confronting it directly, would be better than one more night of lying rigid in the dark, waiting. I pushed the bed frame aside myself that night, unlocked the skeleton key, and stepped into that unfinished closet with nothing but a flashlight. The bare subfloor cold and slightly uneven under my feet, the garage attic beyond it swallowed entirely in a darkness, my flashlight beam only barely dented. The cold in that room had a different quality than the rest of the house's winter chill. A damp, close cold that seemed to settle directly against my skin rather than simply surrounding me, and it carried underneath it a faint smell I hadn't noticed on my earlier visits. Fresh-cut lumber, sharp and resinous, the specific smell of a board freshly sawed rather than old wood that had sat exposed to the air for years. It was standing there, flashlight shaking slightly in my own hand, breathing in that impossible smell of fresh sawdust in a room that hadn't seen new construction in over a decade. That I saw him. He stood near the far edge of where the subfloor gave way to open joists, roughly the height and build of a teenage boy, though nothing about his surface looked like skin. It had the raw, unsanded grain of unfinished lumber, pale and slightly rough, catching my flashlight beam the way real wood catches light, and driven through that grain in irregular clusters. Along his forearms, across one shoulder, were the small dark heads of exposed nails, dozens of them, some flush against the surface, and some standing slightly proud of it, the way nails do in framing that's been left exposed and never properly finished. His face held no features at all, a smooth, sanded oval where a face should have been, and it was that very smoothness, more than anything sharper might have, that made my stomach turn, because it looked less like an absence of a face and more like a face that had simply never been carved yet. I remember thinking, absurdly, in that frozen second before either of us moved, that he looked exactly like something a father might have built partway through a long weekend project and never gotten the chance to finish sanding smooth. He didn't move for a long moment, and neither did I, and then, slowly, one nail-studded arm lifted and reached toward me across the narrow space between us. And I understood, with total clarity, that whatever confusion or anger had kept him tethered to that unfinished space for years intended, finally, to do something about my presence in it, rather than simply announce itself through sound. I turned to run and felt those nail-rough fingers close around my forearm before I'd taken a second step, a grip that scraped rather than crushed. Dozens of small, sharp points digging into my skin at once, and I wrenched free hard enough that I stumbled back through the closet doorway and fell against the hallway wall, my flashlight clattering away across the floor. Behind me, in the sudden dark, I heard a single heavy thump, the same sound I'd heard weeks before through my bedroom ceiling. And then, nothing at all. I sat there against that hallway wall for a long time before I could make myself move again, my forearm throbbing, my whole body shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Some distant, rational part of my mind kept trying to construct an explanation even then. A loose nail catching my sleeve, an old shelf bracket I'd stumbled into in the dark, though I knew, even as I reached for those explanations, that none of them accounted for the deliberate pressure of that grip, or the specific, patient way it had closed around me, rather than simply snagging. When I finally found the nerve to reach for my flashlight and shine it back through the open closet doorway, the room stood empty. Nothing there at all beyond bare subfloor, and the dark rectangle of the garage attic beyond it, as though whatever I'd just seen had never occupied that space to begin with. My forearm, when I finally made myself look at it under the hallway light, carried a dozen or more small puncture marks arranged in a rough band, each one no larger than a splinter's entry point, and over the following days. Several tiny dark slivers of what a doctor in town, baffled, eventually confirmed under a magnifying glass to be old, weathered wood, worked their way out of my skin on their own, the way a splinter does, though I had touched nothing in that unfinished room besides the flashlight in my own hand. The doctor asked me, more than once, where exactly I'd gotten a wound like that, and I gave him some vague answer about an old fence I'd been repairing, an explanation he clearly didn't fully believe, but had no better alternative to offer either. I moved out within the month, giving Gary some vague explanation about wanting to be closer to my remaining family after Sam's death, which was true enough on its own terms, even if it left out the actual reason I could no longer make myself climb those stairs after dark. Gary didn't push for more detail, and I got the sense, from the careful, guilty way he thanked me for my time there, that he already suspected there was more to it than I was saying, the same way there'd clearly been more to Danny's story than he told me when he first hired me. Packing up that house those last few weeks felt different than any move I'd made before, a strange mix of relief and something closer to guilt, as though I were abandoning some obligation I'd never actually agreed to in the first place. I found myself, more than once, apologizing out loud to the empty upstairs hallway as I carried boxes down to my car, a habit I didn't examine too closely at the time and have thought about a great deal since, wondering what exactly I thought I owed an explanation to. I remember standing in the doorway of that closet one last time, the bed frame already loaded into the moving truck outside, and telling it quietly that I was sorry for whatever that was worth to something that had spent years unable to say the same thing back to anyone at all. A colleague of mine, a guy named Marcus from the sales team, took the house next, eager for the same rent-free arrangement I'd had, and I told him, before he moved in, a heavily edited version of my time there. Enough to warn him without sounding like someone who'd lost his grip on reality during a hard winter. He laughed it off the way I probably would have myself a year earlier, told me he didn't believe in any of that, and was mostly just excited about the square footage, and I remember hoping, driving away after helping him move his first few boxes in, that his skepticism might actually count for something, that a person who simply refused to be afraid might somehow be left alone by whatever had spent a whole winter working so hard to unsettle me. He lasted just over a month. He called me himself afterward, rather than simply disappearing the way people sometimes do, and told me he'd been shaving one morning before work, razor halfway through a stroke, when he heard a slam against his bedroom door loud enough that he said it sounded exactly like someone dropping a heavy stack of books flat against the wood from the other side, followed immediately by the sound of running footsteps, fast and heavy, receding down the hallway toward the stairs. He'd opened his door to find the hallway completely empty. No books, no sign of anything having struck the wood at all, and he told me, in a voice that had lost every trace of the easy confidence he usually carried, that he'd packed his car within the week and hadn't looked back once. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd found a fine spray of what looked like sawdust scattered across the hallway floor outside his door that same morning. Fine and pale, nothing in the house that could have produced it. Gone by the time he thought to take a photograph of it to show anyone. Gary tried twice more, after Marcus, to find someone else in the company willing to take the house. And both times, word got around fast enough that he never got a single serious taker. The last I heard, he'd stopped offering it as a housing perk entirely, and the place sits mostly empty now, checked on occasionally by a local property manager who, Gary told me, the one time I asked, refuses to go up to the second floor alone. Gary mentioned, a little sheepishly, that he'd looked into selling the place outright more than once since, and had backed off each time, unable to fully explain to himself why unloading a house he no longer used to anyone still felt, somehow, like passing along a problem he hadn't found a way to properly solve first. I still think, some winter nights in my own apartment 2 states away, about that smooth, faceless oval turning toward me in the dark, and about the particular patient thump that followed me out of that room, the sound, I've come to believe, less of anger than of something enormous finally succeeding. After years of small bumps and footsteps nobody would properly listen to, in getting itself noticed exactly the way it wanted to be. I keep my own bedroom door locked now, out of habit more than any real fear, in every apartment I've lived in since, and some nights, lying awake listening to the ordinary settling sounds of whatever building I happen to be in, I still find myself waiting, half-consciously, for a particular kind of tapping in the hallway outside, patient and unhurried, that I have never once heard again, and that I am not entirely sure, some nights, I wouldn't recognize instantly if I finally did.